Have you ever stood before the grandeur of ancient Chinese palaces? Their sweeping roofs reaching toward the heavens like silent witnesses to centuries of untold stories. Picture the Forbidden City at dusk, the last rays of sun catching its golden tiles, and wonder what echoes of the past still linger within those hallowed walls. These were not just buildings of stone and wood, they were the beating heart of an empire, the stage upon which dramas of unimaginable scale unfolded. Behind every ornate corridor and hidden chamber lay tales of ambition that moved armies, loves that defied tradition, betrayals that toppled dynasties, and mysteries so profound they've captivated historians for generations. This is where emperors communed with the heavens and concubines plotted in whispers, where power was both a crown and a cage. Welcome to the Celestial Kingdoms, a world where history and myth intertwine, where every artifact, every scroll, every silent courtyard holds a piece of a puzzle spanning thousands of years. Think about the sheer weight of it all. Dynasties rising and falling like tides, philosophies shaping civilizations, and human emotions playing out on a stage so vast it still takes our breath away. This isn't just a history lesson, it's an invitation to step into a realm where the past feels alive, where you can almost hear the rustle of silk robes and sense the tension in the air before a fateful decision was made. These stories aren't confined to textbooks, they pulse with life, mystery, and meaning, waiting for us to uncover them together. In this series, we're embarking on a journey deep into the heart of Imperial China, exploring 30 epic tales that defined an era and shaped the world. We'll walk alongside visionary rulers and forgotten heroes, decode cryptic symbols left behind in art and architecture, and unravel enigmas that have puzzled scholars for centuries. This is more than a recounting of events, it's an emotional and intellectual adventure, one that invites you to see history not as a distant memory, but as a living, breathing narrative full of relevance and wonder. So settle in, open your mind, and let's uncover the secrets of the Celestial Kingdoms together, because some stories are too extraordinary to remain untold. Our journey into the Celestial Kingdoms begins not with a historical record, but with a legend so foundational, it is woven into the very soul of Chinese culture. To understand the imperial tradition, we must first venture into the realm of myth, to a time when gods and heroes walked the earth, and a ruler's power was measured by his connection to the heavens themselves. This is the tale of Huangdi, the Yellow Emperor, a figure who stands at the blurry crossroads of memory and myth, credited with nothing less than the invention of civilization itself. His story, passed down through millennia, sets the stage for everything that follows: the divine right of emperors, the pursuit of order, and the belief that a great ruler is a cultural architect. Imagine a land divided, a collection of warring tribes across the ancient plains of the Yellow River Valley. From this chaos emerged a leader of unparalleled wisdom and strength. Huangdi's rise was forged in conflict, most notably his epic battles against Kaiyu, a formidable tribal chieftain often depicted as a horned demon with a bronze head and iron skull. Their climactic struggle was said to be so intense it darkened the skies, but Huangdi, with his strategic genius, invented the compass chariot, a device that could point south no matter which way it turned, cutting through a magical fog summoned by his enemy and securing a victory that would unite the tribes under a single banner. This wasn't just a military conquest, it was the moment a people began to conceive of themselves as one. But his true legacy lies not in conquest, but in creation. The Yellow Emperor is hailed as the patron of a breathtaking array of inventions that define Chinese culture for ages to come. He is said to have given his people the foundational tools of civilization, the first characters of a written language, allowing laws and poetry to be recorded for the first time, the principles of traditional medicine and acupuncture, detailed in the ancient text the Huangdi Nijing, the art of silk production, and even the calendar and music. His wife, Lizu, is credited with discovering silk after a cocoon fell into her tea. Think about the profound nature of this. One legendary figure is presented as the source of law, science, art, and technology, the ultimate symbol of a ruler who brings order and culture from disorder. His departure from this world was as miraculous as his life. After a reign of 100 years, the legends say Huangdi did not die as ordinary men do. Instead, he achieved immortality and ascended to the heavens in broad daylight, carried aloft by a celestial dragon. This final, powerful image is far more than a fantastical ending. It established a crucial precedent for every emperor who would come after him. The dragon, a symbol of immense power and good fortune, became inextricably linked with the sovereign. More importantly, his ascent cemented the idea that the supreme ruler possessed a divine mandate, a direct lineage to the heavenly realm that legitimized his power on earth. This mystical connection between ruler and cosmos would become the bedrock of imperial authority for thousands of years, creating an aura around the throne that was both political and profoundly spiritual. From the mythic ascent of the Yellow Emperor, we descend into a realm where legend begins to brush against the edges of history. If Huangdi represents the ideal of the divinely inspired ruler, then the next great tale asks a far more gripping question. What does it truly take to earn the right to lead? This brings us to the story of a catastrophe so immense it threatened to wipe civilization from its cradle, and the one man whose superhuman effort to save it forged the very philosophical cornerstone of Imperial China. We are speaking of the Great Flood and the rise of Yu the Great, founder of the legendary Xia dynasty. For generations, scholars have debated the historical reality of the Xia. Western historiography, often rigid in its demand for contemporary written records, has frequently classified it as myth. Yet, Chinese tradition holds it as the first hereditary dynasty, a crucial bridge between the age of gods and the age of kings. The truth likely lies somewhere in the silt of the Yellow River. Imagine a climate catastrophe around 4,000 years ago, where relentless rains swelled the rivers into monstrous, uncontrollable forces. The land was submerged, communities were shattered, and famine stalked the survivors. This was not a local disaster. It was an existential crisis that demanded a hero not of brute strength, but of breathtaking perseverance and ingenuity. The emperor at the time, Yao, first tasked a minister named Gun to control the waters. Gun's approach was to build dikes and barriers, attempting to wall the water away. For 9 years he labored, but the floods only grew worse, breaching every defense. As punishment for his failure, Gun was either executed or exiled. A stark lesson that mere effort was not enough, success was what granted legitimacy. His son, Yu, was then given the impossible task. Learning from his father's fatal mistake, Yu realized that confrontation with the water was futile. Instead, he chose a path of profound harmony with the land. He embarked on a monumental journey, surveying the entire realm to understand its natural contours. For 13 years, the legends say, Yu toiled without rest. He dredged new channels to give the raging waters a path to the sea, carving out the courses of China's great rivers. He was so dedicated to his mission that he passed by his own home 3 times, hearing the cries of his infant son, but refused to enter lest it break his focus. His hands became calloused, his body weather-beaten, and he was said to have worn the hair off his legs from constant wading through mud and water. This wasn't just engineering, it was an act of ultimate self-sacrifice for the good of the people. His success in taming the flood didn't just make the land habitable again, it made him a living legend. Out of immense gratitude, the people passed over the throne of the previous ruler's son and bestowed it upon Yu, establishing the Xia dynasty and the principle of merit-based succession. This tale is the narrative birthplace of the mandate of heaven, or Tiananmen. The concept is simple yet profound. Heaven grants the right to rule to a just and virtuous leader. But this mandate is not permanent. It can be withdrawn if the ruler becomes corrupt, incompetent, or ceases to care for the people's welfare. The flood was heaven's test. Gun's failure showed he had lost the mandate, while Yu's incredible success proved he had gained it. His rule was justified not by divine birthright alone, but by his tangible, earthly achievements. He earned the throne through action. The search for physical proof of Yu's dynasty leads us to the archaeological site of Erlitou, in the fertile plains of the Yellow River Valley. Discovered in the 1950s, Erlitou reveals the remains of a vast, sophisticated Bronze Age capital that flourished around the time the Xia dynasty was said to exist. Archaeologists have unearthed a palace complex with grand ceremonial foundations, elite burials with exquisite jade and bronze ritual vessels, and workshops for bronze casting, the earliest found in China. This was clearly a place of immense political and cultural power. The debate rages: is this the legendary capital of the Xia, or is it an early phase of the Shang dynasty that followed? While a direct link remains elusive, Erlitou provides the tantalizing material evidence of a state-level society, exactly where and when tradition placed the Xia. It proves that the world described in the Tales of Yu was not a fantasy, but a reality of emerging kingship and monumental organization. The man himself may be shrouded in legend, but the kingdom he founded is stepping out from the shadows of history, one artifact at a time. The legendary transition from the mythic Xia to the historical Shang dynasty represents one of history's most profound shifts, moving from tales of flood-taming heroes to a world illuminated by the written word. For centuries, the Shang existed as a hazy mention in later historical texts, a dynasty many Western scholars dismissed as mere legend, another layer of cultural myth-making. But then, at the dawn of the 20th century, a discovery of staggering importance would shatter those doubts, pulling a forgotten kingdom from the earth and confirming its power through the most intimate medium imaginable, the very questions its kings asked of the gods. This is the story of the Oracle Bones, the sacred archives of the Shang. Picture the final years of the Qing dynasty in the late 1800s. In a small pharmacy in the city of Anyang, an antiques dealer named Wang Yang made a bewildering find. Amongst so-called dragon bones, a fossilized animal bones ground into powder for traditional medicine, he noticed several fragments with strange, ancient markings that looked nothing like the Chinese script he knew. A keen scholar, his curiosity was ignited. He began urgently collecting these inscribed fragments, realizing he had stumbled upon something extraordinary. Tragically, Wang would die during the Boxer Rebellion before he could fully unravel the mystery, but he had lit a fuse. The hunt was on. His discovery launched a frantic treasure hunt, with collectors and researchers scouring the area around Anyang. The source was finally pinpointed to a barren field near the village of Xiaotun, a place locals had long plundered for these lucrative bones. By 1928, the Academia Sinica launched the first major scientific excavations, and what they unearthed was nothing short of an archaeological revolution. They hadn't just found a cache of artifacts, they had discovered the lost capital of the Shang dynasty, a city called Yin. The sheer scale of the find was breathtaking royal tombs filled with magnificent bronze vessels and sacrificed retainers, workshops, palaces, and thousands upon thousands of these inscribed bones. A civilization that had been a ghost in the historical record was suddenly, vibrantly real. But what exactly were these objects? They were the tools of the highest authority in the land, the king's diviners. The process was a sacred ritual. A diviner, often the king himself, would pose a direct question to his royal ancestors, who acted as intermediaries with the high god Dai. The questions were carved onto a specially prepared turtle plastron or the shoulder blade of an ox. The diviner would then apply a hot metal rod to a hollowed-out point on the bone, causing it to crack with a loud pop. The pattern of these cracks was believed to be the ancestor's answer, a binary yes or no from the spirit world. The diviner would then interpret the cracks, and often the final outcome of the event was later carved onto the same bone, creating a permanent record of prophecy and result. The subjects of these inquiries reveal the immense worries and duties of a Bronze Age king. They sought guidance on every conceivable aspect of statecraft and life. Will the queen's childbirth be fortunate? If we raise an army of 3,000 men to attack the Kaiying Fang, will Dai support us? Should we make a ritual sacrifice to Ancestor Yi? Will there be disaster in the coming 10-day week? We see a ruler deeply concerned with war, harvests, the weather, illness, and the construction of cities. The answers were not merely predictions. They were the foundation of state policy, directing military campaigns, agricultural planning, and the complex calendar of rituals required to keep the cosmos in balance. Beyond their historical confirmation, the oracle bones are our window into the dawn of Chinese writing. The script inscribed on them is the direct ancestor of modern Chinese characters. While archaic, it is a fully formed and sophisticated system. We can see the pictographic origins of many characters. A horse clearly looks like a horse. A river resembles flowing water. This script is the oldest known form of Chinese writing, and its very existence on these bones demonstrates that literacy and bureaucratic record-keeping were central to the Shang state's power. They didn't just ask questions of the gods, they wrote down the answers, building a bureaucracy of the divine. The cosmology revealed is equally fascinating. The Shang worldview was not centered on a single, omnipotent god, but on a complex hierarchy. At the top was Dai, a somewhat distant high god who controlled natural forces like thunder, rain, and drought. Below Dai were the pantheon of royal ancestors, who could intercede with Dai on behalf of the living king. The king's primary role was to maintain harmony through correct ritual and sacrifice, often involving copious amounts of millet wine and the offering of animals and sometimes human victims. This constant dialogue with the supernatural was the bedrock of their power, a divine contract that legitimized their rule. The rediscovery of the oracle bones did more than just confirm a dynasty. It gave a voice to its kings, allowing us to hear their hopes, their fears, and their unwavering belief that the fate of their kingdom was written in the cracks of a bone. Yet for all its power and divine legitimacy, the Shang dynasty's grip on the mandate of heaven would not last forever. The very cosmological principle the Shang kings relied upon for their authority contained the seeds of their own downfall. For the mandate is not a permanent possession. It is a sacred trust that can be withdrawn from an unworthy ruler and bestowed upon another. This brings us to one of history's most consequential rebellions, a moment that would forever define the moral parameters of political power in China, the Zhou conquest of the Shang and the legendary Battle of Mui. As the Shang state entered its final phase under King Daizin, later pejoratively named Zhou, the cracks in its divine legitimacy began to show. Later historical texts, written by the victorious Zhou, paint him as the archetypal tyrant, a monster of decadence and cruelty. He was accused of constructing a lake of wine and forest of meat, forcing his courtiers and concubines to engage in naked debauchery within it. He reportedly invented horrific tortures, such as the roast meat punishment, where dissidents were roasted alive on a bronze pillar heated by coals. While this is likely propagandistic exaggeration, it served a crucial purpose for the rebels. It provided the moral justification for what was, on its face, an act of treason against the divinely appointed king. The rising challengers were the Zhou, a people originally from the western frontiers of the Shang realm. They were initially seen as a useful, if somewhat rustic, buffer against nomadic tribes. Under a series of shrewd and visionary leaders like King Wen and his son King Wu, the Zhou began consolidating power and building a coalition of disaffected Shang vassals. King Wen, known as the Cultured King, was portrayed as the virtuous opposite of Daizin, a just administrator, a wise lawgiver, and a man of profound moral character. His untimely death passed the mantle of rebellion to his son, King Wu, the martial king, who would be the one to ultimately challenge the Shang Colossus. The philosophical heart of this rebellion was the Zhou's masterful reinterpretation and formalization of the mandate of heaven. They took the existing concept and gave it a powerful moral turn. For the Zhou, heaven did not simply grant its mandate based on ritual correctness or the ability to communicate with ancestors. It granted it to those who possessed du, or moral virtue. A ruler who was virtuous would enjoy peace and prosperity. A ruler who became corrupt, selfish, and cruel, who neglected the welfare of his people, would lose that mandate. Heaven would then send down natural disasters and social unrest as warnings. If the ruler failed to reform, heaven would withdraw its mandate and bestow it upon a new, worthy dynasty. This was a revolutionary idea. It made rebellion against a tyrant not just permissible, but a sacred duty. The Zhou weren't traitors. They were heaven's chosen instruments for restoring moral order. The final confrontation was preceded by a series of strange and powerful omens that were interpreted as heaven's clear signal. According to records, a fiery red pheasant, a potent symbol of the Shang, was seen alighting on a Zhou altar, an event read as the Shang's spirit abandoning its own dynasty. Even more dramatic were the accounts of King Wu's divination before the battle. When he consulted the tortoise shell to ask if victory was assured, the omen was unexpectedly negative, suggesting defeat. His ministers and allies were terrified and urged retreat, but at this critical moment, his uncle, the Duke of Zhou, intervened. He argued that the tortoise shell was wrong. The moral imperative was so clear, heavens were so obvious, that they must override the literal divination and advance. This astonishing moment highlights a shift from blind ritual to a more nuanced, virtue-based interpretation of the cosmos. The two armies finally met at Mui, a plain near the Shang capital. The Zhou forces, though smaller, were highly motivated and united. The Shang king, by contrast, was forced to rely on a massive but disorganized army, including slaves and prisoners of war who had no loyalty to his cause. The Book of Songs describes the battle with almost mythic grandeur. King Wu inspiring his troops with a mighty speech, and the Zhou chariots charging like thunder. But the most telling detail is that the Shang's own slave soldiers turned their spears against them, welcoming the Zhou as liberators. The battle was less a military contest, and more the final, violent confirmation that the Shang had indeed lost the will of both heaven and the people. King Daizin, seeing his cause was lost, retreated to his palace, adorned himself in precious jewels, and set his own pleasure tower ablaze, perishing in the flames. The Zhou victory at Mai was far more than a simple change of management. It was a world-altering event that established a political philosophy that would resonate for 3,000 years. Every subsequent Chinese dynasty would use the mandate of heaven to justify its rule, and would point to the failures of its predecessor as proof that the mandate had been lost. The story of the righteous Zhou rebellion against the corrupt Shang became the foundational political parable of Imperial China, a constant reminder to every emperor on the dragon throne that his power was conditional upon his virtue. The king was no longer just a high priest, he was the moral shepherd of his people, accountable to heaven itself. With the Shang dynasty toppled, and the mandate of heaven now firmly in the hands of the Zhou, King Wu faced the monumental task of governing a vast and restive new empire. But his triumph was cruelly short-lived. Just a few years after his victory at Mui, the martial king fell gravely ill. The fledgling dynasty, still fragile and surrounded by powerful Shang loyalists, teetered on the brink of collapse before it had even truly begun. On his deathbed, King Wu faced an impossible dilemma. His heir and son, King Cheng, was merely a child, far too young to shoulder the immense burden of kingship and suppress the inevitable rebellions. In this moment of supreme crisis, the fate of the Zhou rested on the shoulders of one man, the king's younger brother, the Duke of Zhou. His decision in that moment would become the ultimate test of loyalty and political wisdom, defining the very soul of Chinese statecraft for centuries to come. Rather than seizing the throne for himself, which was his right as a powerful and experienced brother of the king, the Duke of Zhou made a choice that would echo through history. He declared himself regent, swearing a sacred oath to heaven and his ancestors to protect the throne for his young nephew until the boy came of age. He articulated a radical philosophy of governance. He would not be a usurper, but a steward. He famously stated that if he could only ensure the stability and prosperity of the Zhou realm, he would willingly accept any personal slander or misunderstanding that came his way. This was an unprecedented act of self-abnegation in an era where power was almost always seized, not surrendered. He was placing the stability of the state and the legitimacy of the dynastic line above his own ambition, establishing a powerful precedent for ministerial loyalty. Almost immediately, his resolve was tested by fire. His own brothers, uncles to the young king, saw his regency not as an act of loyalty, but as a brazen power grab. Guan Shu and Kai Shu, who had been entrusted with overseeing the conquered Shang descendants, instead fueled the flames of rebellion. They spread vicious rumors that the Duke of Zhou had poisoned King Wu, and was now plotting to kill the young king to take the throne for himself. They forged a powerful and treacherous alliance with Wu Zheng, the son of the last Shang king, who saw a chance to restore his own dynasty. This was the ultimate betrayal, a civil war within the royal family itself, threatening to tear the Zhou apart from the inside just as it was being born. The Duke of Zhu's response was swift and decisive. He mobilized the royal armies and embarked on a massive military campaign to crush the rebellion. The ensuing war was brutal and protracted, but through strategic genius and unwavering determination, he emerged victorious. His brothers were captured, and Wu Zheng was executed. This victory was more than just a military conquest. It was a forceful reaffirmation of the central authority of the Zhou king, even if that king was still a child in the capital. It sent a clear message that the mandate of heaven was not a trivial thing to be challenged by opportunists, and that the unity of the state was paramount. With the rebellion quelled, the Duke of Zhu turned from warrior to architect. His most enduring legacy was the creation of the Fengjian system, often translated as feudalism. To govern the vast new territories, he embarked on a grand project of political engineering. He parceled out land and titles to loyal relatives, allies, and even some defeated Shang nobles who pledged allegiance. These vassals, known as Zhuhu, were sent to establish garrison cities across the realm. They swore oaths of loyalty to the Zhou king, promising military support and tribute in exchange for local autonomy. This system was a masterstroke. It created a network of loyal power centers that could effectively control distant regions, spread Zhou culture, and act as a buffer against nomadic incursions and internal revolt. It was a cellular structure for an empire, allowing it to expand and stabilize simultaneously, but his vision extended far beyond mere political structure. The Duke of Zhu is credited with formalizing the elaborate system of rites and music, known as Liu, that became the bedrock of Chinese civilization. He codified a complex set of rituals for everything from ancestral worship and court ceremonies to weddings and funerals. This wasn't about empty pageantry. It was about creating a unified cultural and moral framework. The rites provided a script for social harmony, defining the relationships between ruler and subject, father and son, husband and wife. The accompanying music was designed to cultivate virtue and refine the emotions. Together, they were tools for civilizing the realm, transforming raw military conquest into a lasting cultural order based on respect, hierarchy, and propriety. After 7 years of steadfast rule, the Duke of Zhu faced his final and greatest act. True to his oath, the moment his nephew, King Shang, came of age, the regent did the unthinkable. He willingly and gracefully returned all power to the rightful king. There was no struggle, no reluctance. He stepped back from the throne he had held and defended at great personal cost, and became a loyal minister once more. This single act completed his legend, transforming him from a powerful regent into the paradigmatic virtuous minister. He proved that ultimate loyalty was not to power itself, but to the principles of righteousness and legitimate succession. Centuries later, his legacy would find its most famous admirer. The philosopher Confucius, who lived during a time of chronic warfare and moral decay, looked back to the Duke of Zhu as the ultimate model of a virtuous leader. Confucius famously lamented in his old age, "How I have gone downhill. For a long time, I have not dreamed of the Duke of Zhu." He saw in the Duke's actions the perfect embodiment of his own ideals, a leader who ruled through moral example rather than brute force, who placed duty and ritual above personal desire, and who ensured stability through righteousness. For Confucius, the Duke of Zhu was not just a historical figure. He was the gold standard of statecraft, a shining example from a golden age that he desperately wished to restore. Through Confucius's veneration, the story of the regent who saved a dynasty became immortalized as a central lesson in the Chinese political imagination, a timeless tale of how wisdom and selfless duty can forge an empire. Yet the golden age of the Zhu, so carefully constructed by the Duke of Zhu, would not last forever. The very feudal system he designed to ensure stability would, over centuries, become the source of the dynasty's undoing. Power slowly seeped away from the royal court and into the hands of the very regional lords it had created, setting the stage for a catastrophic event that would shatter the king's authority forever. This brings us to the desperate flight of King Ping, a moment of panic and survival that would irrevocably divide the Zhou dynasty and unleash an era of both unparalleled chaos and breathtaking philosophical genius. For generations, the Zhou kings ruled from their magnificent western capital of Heijing, a symbol of their power and connection to their ancestral homeland. But by the 8th century before the Common Era, that power had become more ceremonial than real. The regional lords, whose territories had grown rich and strong, often ignored the king's commands, pursuing their own rivalries and wars. The Zhou court was like a grand, aging parent whose children no longer listened, still respected in name, but increasingly irrelevant in action. The state's military strength had dwindled, leaving it vulnerable on all fronts. The greatest threat came from the west, from the fierce nomadic tribes known as the Quanrong, who viewed the settled Zhou lands as a target for plunder. The immediate chain of events began not with a barbarian, but with a love story gone terribly wrong. King Yu, the penultimate king of the Western Zhou, was infatuated with his concubine Bao Si, a woman legendary for her beauty, but who, the histories claim, never smiled. Determined to win her favor, the king committed a series of reckless acts that would seal his fate. He deposed his legitimate queen and her son, the crown prince Yijiu, and replaced them with Bao Si and her own son. This was a profound violation of the rights so cherished by the Zhou, alienating the court and his key allies. His most infamous stunt was to light the beacon fires, the emergency signal used to summon the feudal lords and their armies in times of dire invasion. When the lords arrived in a panic, only to find it was a joke to amuse his stone-faced concubine, she finally laughed. The king repeated the deception multiple times, training the lords to ignore the very system that was meant to protect the realm. When the Quanrong eventually did launch a real, massive invasion, the signal fires were lit once more. But this time, the lords, believing it to be another of the king's cruel jokes, refused to come. The barbarians swarmed into Heijing, sacking the capital and killing King Yu. His beloved Bao Si was captured or killed, and the capital was left in ruins. In the aftermath, the slain king's previously deposed son, Yijiu, was rescued by a coalition of lords who remained loyal to the legitimate line. They proclaimed him King Ping. But the western capital was destroyed and indefensible. Facing the continued threat of the Quanrong, the new king made a momentous decision. He would abandon the sacred western capital forever and move the court east, to a new, safer location at Chengzhou, near modern-day Luoyang. This journey, the flight of King Ping eastward in 770 years before the Common Era, is the great dividing line in Zhou history. Everything before is known as the Western Zhou, everything after, the Eastern Zhou. On the surface, it was a strategic retreat to ensure the dynasty's survival. But in reality, it was a catastrophic admission of weakness. By fleeing, King Ping sacrificed the heartland of Zhou power, and with it, the last vestiges of the king's temporal authority. He was now completely dependent on the feudal lords who had protected him, most notably the states of Qin, Shang, and Jin. They had saved the dynasty, but in doing so, they had become its masters. The mandate of heaven still technically resided with the Zhou king, but he now held little more than ritual significance, a figurehead who could grant titles and legitimize the actions of others, but who could not command an army or enforce his own will. This erosion of central power did not create a vacuum for long. Instead, it unleashed an intense and competitive new era known as the Spring and Autumn period, named after the chronicles from the state of Lu that recorded these events. With the Zhou king reduced to a mere priest king, the powerful regional states began to jockey for dominance. Yet this wasn't initially the total warfare that would come later. It was a time of complex diplomacy, shifting alliances, and a curious code of honor among nobles. The strongest lords sought not to conquer all of China, but to become the Ba, or hegemon, a recognized leader who would ostensibly uphold the Zhou rights and protect the nominal king from external threats, all while extending their own influence and power. This created a fragile, multi-state system where warfare was often limited and ritualized, and where diplomatic cunning was as important as military strength. Paradoxically, this political fragmentation and constant competition became the perfect incubator for intellectual and philosophical revolution. As old certainties collapsed, thinkers and scholars traveled from state to state, offering their advice to rulers on how to achieve order, stability, and power. This was the environment that gave birth to the 100 schools of thought, the most explosive period of philosophical inquiry in Chinese history. It was during the Eastern Zhu that the great pillars of Chinese thought, Confucianism, Taoism, legalism, and Moism first took shape, each offering a radically different diagnosis for the chaos and a prescription for a better world. The very instability caused by King Ping's flight created the need for these new ideas, forcing a profound re-examination of the nature of government, society, and the cosmos itself. The king's loss was philosophy's gain, setting in motion an intellectual golden age that would define Chinese culture for millennia. To come into this maelstrom of competing states and crumbling tradition stepped a figure whose failure in his own lifetime would paradoxically cement his success for the next 2 millennia. The teacher and philosopher we know as Confucius. Born Kong Qiu in 551 before the Common Era in the state of Lu, a state known for its preservation of Zhu rituals, he came of age witnessing the very chaos the Duke of Zhu had sought to prevent. The world was upside down, rulers were assassinated by their own ministers, sons overthrew fathers, and the sacred rites were mocked or ignored. Confucius looked at this moral decay and diagnosed a simple, yet radical, cure. The problem was not a lack of laws or armies, but a collapse of ethical character and social relationships. His life's mission became a quixotic quest to find a ruler who would understand that true power flows not from the sword, but from virtue. His vision for an ideal state was not a blueprint for a new form of government, but a call to return to an idealized past, the golden age of the early Zhu. He believed the sage kings like the Duke of Zhu had already discovered the formula for a harmonious society, a system of proper relationships, ritual propriety, and moral example. His core idea was Ren, a complex term often translated as benevolence or humaneness. For Confucius, Ren was the essential quality of a good person, an inner compassion and empathy that should guide all action. But this inner virtue had to be expressed through Lai, the external practice of ritual and etiquette. From the grand ceremonies of state down to how one greets an elder, these rituals were the scaffolding that held society together, teaching respect, humility, and order through practiced action. Armed with this philosophy, Confucius and a dedicated band of disciples embarked on a wearying journey across the various warring states. He offered his counsel to dukes and kings, promising that by embodying Ren and practicing Lai, they would become such moral paragons that their people would flock to them willingly, and other states would submit without a fight. It was a tough sell. One ruler, intrigued, asked about military strategy. Confucius famously replied, "I have heard about the ritual conduct of sacrifices, but I have not studied warfare." His audience with Duke Jing of Kai typified his experience. The Duke was initially impressed, considering granting him land, but his minister warned him that Confucius's ideas were too lofty and impractical for the brutal realities of the age. The philosopher's standards were too high. He could not serve a ruler who was not utterly committed to moral perfection. One by one, the doors of power closed to him. He was a brilliant theorist of statecraft in an era that demanded ruthless pragmatists. Despite this political failure, his journey was not in vain. It was during these years of travel, and often hardship, that he refined his teachings through constant dialogue with his disciples. These conversations, later compiled into the Analects, reveal a pragmatic and nuanced teacher. He understood that his ideals were a difficult path. When asked if one should require good for good, he replied, "What then will you require for good? Require injury with justice, and require good with good." He taught a doctrine of gradual self-cultivation, stating that one should set your heart on the way, base yourself in virtue, rely on Ren, and journey in the arts. His ultimate goal was to create junzi, often translated as gentlemen or exemplary persons, not nobles by birth, but individuals of profound moral character and education who could lead and serve society with wisdom. Returning to Lu in his old age, his political ambitions unfulfilled, Confucius turned to a project that would secure his legacy far more than any governmental post ever could. He devoted himself to collecting and editing the ancient texts that he believed contained the wisdom of the sages. This monumental effort resulted in the 5 classics, the Book of Songs, a collection of ancient poetry that revealed the emotions and values of the people, the Book of Documents, which contained speeches and records of ancient rulers, the Book of Rites, detailing the ceremonial practices of the Zhou, the Book of Changes, a divination manual he infused with ethical commentary, and the Spring Autumn Annals, a history of his home state of Lu that he edited to encode moral judgments on events through subtle word choices. In curating these works, he wasn't just preserving history. He was creating the canonical curriculum for his new ideal of leadership, the educated, ethical Junzi. His death in 479 BCE seemed to mark the end of a feudal dream, yet his students preserved and propagated his teachings. Centuries later, during the Han Dynasty, his philosophy would be rescued from obscurity and elevated to the status of a state orthodoxy. Rulers finally realized that a system teaching loyalty, respect for hierarchy, and the moral responsibility of the ruler was the perfect glue for holding a vast empire together. The failed politician became the ultimate success, his ideas shaping the administrative elite through the imperial examination system and defining the social and ethical fabric of East Asia. The man who could not find a single ruler to listen to him in life eventually became the unchallenged teacher of emperors for 2,000 years, proving that in the long arc of history, the power of an idea can indeed be greater than the power of the sword. While the philosophers of the Hundred Schools debated the nature of a just society, one state in the western frontier was quietly perfecting the art of ruthless, total war. The state of Qin was long viewed by the Eastern powers as a semi-barbaric backwater, its customs crude and its people unrefined. But under a series of calculating rulers, Qin embraced a radical new philosophy that prized state power and agricultural output above all else: legalism. This doctrine, which dismissed Confucian virtue as a useless fantasy, would provide the engine for the most stunning and terrifying unification in Chinese history, led by a figure of unparalleled ambition and paranoia Yingzheng, who would crown himself Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of China. Legalism, as formulated by ministers like Shang and Lai Si, was a chillingly pragmatic system. It argued that human nature is inherently selfish and short-sighted, and therefore cannot be governed by moral example or ritual. Instead, the state must control its people through a strict framework of laws, or fa, that promised rich rewards for obedience and brutal, inescapable punishment for any transgression. The Qin state was reorganized into a meritocratic war machine. The old aristocracy was broken, with ranks and titles granted only for military success or increased agricultural production. Families were grouped into units of 5 or 10, where every member was held collectively responsible for the crimes of any individual, fostering a culture of constant surveillance and mutual distrust. This created a society of unparalleled discipline and productive power, perfectly tuned for one purpose: conquest, when the young Yingzheng ascended the Qin throne in 246 CE, he inherited this formidable apparatus. Over the next 2 decades, he unleashed its full force upon the 6 remaining warring states in a relentless military campaign. His armies, armed with advanced crossbows and organized with terrifying efficiency, moved with a speed and brutality that shocked their enemies. The Qin strategy was not merely to defeat opposing armies, but to shatter their will to resist, often through sheer terror. The conquest of the state of Zhao was particularly brutal, with historical accounts claiming hundreds of thousands of captives were executed. One by one, the states fell Han, Zhao, Wei, Chu, Yan, and finally Kai in 221 CE. For the first time in centuries, the land was united under a single, powerful sovereign. His work, however, had only just begun. Having conquered the known world, Qin Shi Huang faced an even greater challenge: how to weld these culturally distinct, perpetually warring regions into a single, cohesive empire that would not instantly fracture after his death. His solution was a breathtaking project of standardization that touched every aspect of life. He abolished the feudal system that had caused so much chaos during the Zhou, replacing it with a centralized bureaucracy of 36 administrative provinces, each governed by officials appointed and rotated by the emperor himself. This destroyed local power bases and ensured all authority flowed directly from the throne. Then came the decrees that would literally reshape the landscape of Chinese civilization. He mandated a single, unified script for all written Chinese, replacing the myriad regional variations. This one act was perhaps his most enduring legacy, creating a written language that could be understood by officials from any region, binding the educated elite together, and facilitating administration across the vast empire. He standardized currency, weights, and measures, wiping out local economic systems to create a seamless national market. He even decreed a universal standard for the axle width of all carts, ensuring that every wagon could travel on the newly built imperial roads without getting stuck in the ruts. These roads, a vast network stretching thousands of miles, allowed his armies and officials to move with unprecedented speed, tying the empire together with stone and gravel. Yet for all his vision as an administrator, Qin Shi Huang was a man consumed by two profound fears: the threat of invasion from the northern nomads and his own mortality. To address the first, he ordered the connection and massive expansion of existing frontier walls into what would become the foundational structure of the Great Wall of China. This project was as much an undertaking of human suffering as it was of engineering. Hundreds of thousands of conscripted laborers, including soldiers, peasants, and convicts, were forced to work under brutal conditions, with countless lives lost to exhaustion, exposure, and disease. While effective as a barrier against cavalry, the wall stood as a monument to the emperor's imperial power and his willingness to expend human life for the sake of his realm's security. His second fear, death, drove him to even more extreme measures. He became obsessed with finding the elixir of immortality, dispatching expeditions with hundreds of young men and women to search for the mythical Pinglai Mountain, the home of the immortals. At his main palace, he constructed a network of 270 concealed rooms and connecting passageways, and he moved among them constantly so that no one, not even his closest ministers, knew his exact location at any given time, a desperate attempt to cheat any assassin or the very spirit of death itself. This paranoia extended to the intellectual class. Alarmed by scholars who criticized his harsh methods by pointing to the virtuous rulers of the past, he enacted the most infamous act of his reign: the burning of the books and the burying of the scholars. In 213 BCE, on the advice of his legalist minister Lai Si, he ordered the destruction of all historical records and philosophical texts from the other states, sparing only practical manuals on medicine, agriculture, and divination. Those who dared to hide texts were branded with tattoos and sent to work on the Great Wall. A year later, he reportedly had over 460 scholars buried alive for allegedly deceiving him, an act intended to terrify the intellectual class into submission and erase any ideological challenge to his absolute rule. His final and most spectacular project was a kingdom for the afterlife. From the moment he took the throne, work began on his mausoleum, a project that would occupy 700,000 laborers for nearly 40 years. Historical texts describe it as a microcosm of his empire, with palaces filled with rare jewels, ceilings inlaid with pearls to represent the stars, and rivers of flowing mercury. For centuries, these accounts were dismissed as fanciful exaggeration. Then, in 1974, farmers digging a well outside the city of Xi'an struck one of the most breathtaking archaeological discoveries of all time: the Terracotta Army. Thousands of life-sized, uniquely detailed clay soldiers, chariots, and horses were found standing in battle formation, guarding the eastern approach to the emperor's tomb. This silent legion, crafted with an astonishing level of individual artistry, was meant to protect the emperor and allow him to rule forever in the next world, just as he had in this one. The main tomb mound itself remains unexcavated, a testament to both respect for the dead and the technological challenges of preserving whatever wonders and potential traps lie within. Qin Shi Huang died in 210 BCE during one of his tours of the empire. His death was kept secret by his ministers to prevent uprising, and his carriage was accompanied by a cart of rotting fish to disguise the smell of his decaying body. The dynasty he built with such iron will collapsed in rebellion just 4 years after his death, its harsh policies having bred immense popular resentment. Yet, despite its brief duration, the Qin dynasty established the essential blueprint for Imperial China. The ideal of a unified, centralized state, administered by a non-hereditary bureaucracy, using a common written language and standardized systems, became the model every subsequent dynasty would strive to emulate. The first emperor's methods were brutal and terrifying, but his vision of a single Chinese state, from the walls in the north to the sea in the south, proved so powerful that it has endured, in spirit, for over 2,000 years. Yet, for all the undeniable power of his standardized systems and monumental walls, the first emperor's rule was haunted by a fear far deeper than any foreign invasion, the fear of dissent, of memory, and of ideas themselves. His legalist philosophy demanded absolute uniformity not just in action, but in thought. He could standardize axle widths and script, but how does one standardize the human mind? The answer he settled upon would become one of history's most chilling examples of cultural annihilation: the infamous decree to burn the books and bury the scholars alive. This was not a random act of tyranny. It was a calculated, ideological strike at the very roots of the past to strangle any possible future that did not conform to his vision. The immediate catalyst was a fierce debate at court in 213 B.C.E. A Confucian scholar named Chunyu Yu dared to challenge the emperor's entire system. He argued that the qin, to ensure its longevity, should return to the ancient ways of the Zhu by enfeoffing the emperor's sons and relatives as princes over territories, essentially advocating for a return to feudalism. To the legalist mind of the emperor's chief minister, Lai Si, this was not just a difference of opinion. It was treasonous nostalgia, a dangerous appeal to a past that the qin had violently overthrown. Lai Si saw in the scholars and their cherished texts a direct threat to the state's absolute authority. These books, filled with praises of ancient kings and critiques of harsh rule, provided a blueprint for opposition. They offered an alternative model of governance based on virtue and ritual, a model that could legitimize dissent against the qin's reign of fear. Lai Si's response was a memo to the emperor that laid out a terrifyingly logical case for intellectual tyranny. He argued that these scholars, using the past to criticize the present, were confusing the people and undermining the law. Their private teachings and debates created factions and sowed doubt. The solution, he proposed, was radical and total. To unify the people's minds and secure the empire's future, the past itself had to be erased. The emperor agreed, and the decree was issued. It ordered the burning of all books in private possession, with a few narrow exceptions. Practical manuals on medicine, agriculture, and forestry were spared, as were divination texts, which the emperor himself consulted in his quest for immortality. The most catastrophic loss was to history and philosophy. The Book of Songs, the Book of Documents, and the writings of the 100 schools of thought, the entire intellectual heritage of the pre-qin era, were condemned to the flames. The mechanics of the suppression were ruthlessly efficient. The empire was divided into zones of compliance. People were commanded to bring their scrolls and text to local magistrates to be incinerated. Those who dared to hide books were branded with tattoos and sent to labor on the emperor's massive construction projects, like the Great Wall. To discuss the forbidden texts amongst themselves was punishable by public execution. To cite the ancient classics to criticize present policy was a crime that extended the punishment to the offender's entire family. This was more than censorship. It was an attempt to sever the people's connection to their own history, to create a population that knew only the qin's laws and the qin's version of reality. But the story takes an even darker turn. The traditional historical accounts, primarily from the Han Dynasty historian Sima Qian, report that the emperor's paranoia did not stop with the burning of paper and silk. Just a year later, in 212 B.C.E., he allegedly committed an even more horrifying act. Frustrated that his court alchemists and scholars had failed to deliver the promised elixirs of immortality, and fearing they were mocking him, he ordered a purge. According to the records, he had over 460 scholars rounded up, accused of deception and spreading falsehoods, and buried alive in a pit near the capital. This burying of the scholars was a message written in flesh and blood. Intellectual dissent would not just be silenced, it would be extinguished in the most brutal way imaginable, a literal suffocation of opposing thought. The long-term cultural impact is a story of both devastating loss and remarkable resilience. An incalculable amount of pre-Qin thought was indeed lost forever. Countless unique philosophical treatises, historical records from the conquered states, and poetic anthologies vanished into the ash, creating permanent gaps in our understanding of ancient Chinese civilization. However, the attempt was not entirely successful. Brave individuals throughout the empire, at great personal risk, hid their precious texts in walls, under floors, or committed them to memory. Decades later, when the Han Dynasty rose to power and began seeking out the old wisdom, these texts were rediscovered, often in a fragmentary state or through the oral recitation of elderly scholars. This process of recovery, though imperfect, saved a core part of the tradition. Nevertheless, the canon that emerged was forever shaped by the Qin's fire. We only have a fraction of what once existed, and our view of the past is filtered through this narrow, salvaged lens. Beyond the immediate loss, Qin Shi Huang's actions established a toxic and recurring dynamic in Imperial Chinese history: the deeply fraught relationship between the autocratic ruler and the intellectual scholar. The state, with its monopoly on force, always held the upper hand, but it also depended on the scholarly class to administer the vast bureaucracy. Scholars were the keepers of tradition, the writers of history, and the moral conscience of the empire, often appealing to the ethical models of the past to critique the abuses of the present. This created a perpetual tension. Emperors needed their administrative skill, but feared their independent thought and their power to shape historical judgment. The burning of the books became the ultimate cautionary tale, a stark reminder of what could happen when the throne felt sufficiently threatened by the pen. This pattern of intellectual purges, literary inquisitions, and the stifling of dissent would repeat itself for centuries, a chilling legacy of the first emperor's attempt to not just rule the land, but to control the very ideas that gave it meaning. With the iron grip of the Qin dynasty broken and its capital in ashes, the empire descended into a whirlwind of chaos and ambition. The vacuum of power left by its collapse did not lead to a peaceful transition, but ignited a ferocious struggle between two men of utterly contrasting character and vision. This was the Chu-Han contention, a 4-year civil war so packed with heroism, tragedy, and strategic brilliance that it would become the archetypal tale of rivalry in Chinese history. On one side stood Zhang Yu, the noble, physically peerless warrior king, the last great champion of the old aristocratic order. Arrayed against him was Liu Bang, a cunning and pragmatic peasant-born official, a man with no royal blood but an uncanny genius for winning the hearts of people. Their conflict would decide not only who would wear the crown, but what kind of empire would rise from the Qin's ashes. Zhang Yu seemed destined for glory from birth. He was a scion of the old Chu aristocracy, a man of immense physical strength and martial prowess who could instill both awe and terror. The histories describe him as a leader who shared the hardships of his common soldiers, weeping and offering his own food and drink when they suffered. But this nobility was paired with a volatile and often brutal temper. After a victorious battle, he was known to order the massacre of an entire surrendered army, believing it a military necessity, but horrifying the populace. His vision for China was a return to the fractured past, a coalition of 19 rival kingdoms with himself as the overlord, or hegemon king of Chu. He believed in honor, personal loyalty, and the inherent right of the high-born to rule. He was, in many ways, the last hero of a dying age. Liu Bang could not have been more different. A former minor patrol officer and village drunkard from a peasant family, he possessed none of Zhang Yu's martial charisma or noble bearing. He was often rude, uncultured, and dismissed by his rivals as a rustic bumpkin. But his shortcomings masked a profound political intelligence. Where Zhang Yu trusted only his own strength, Liu Bang understood the power of delegation. He was a master at identifying talent, regardless of its social origin, and then trusting his experts to do their jobs. His greatest assets were his chief strategist, the enigmatic Zhang Liang, a genius of grand strategy, and his quartermaster, Zhao He, an administrative wizard who could keep an army supplied and a territory governed efficiently. Liu Bang's greatest skill was his pragmatism. He did what worked, unburdened by aristocratic notions of honor. The early phase of the war saw Zhang Yu at the peak of his power, dominating his rival in a series of dramatic engagements. The most famous of these was the feast at Hong Gate, a moment of high-stakes tension that reads like a thriller. Zhang Yu, persuaded by his advisor that Liu Bang was a threat, invited him to a banquet with the intention of assassinating him. Liu Bang, knowing he was walking into a trap, went anyway with a small escort that included his fierce bodyguard Fan Kuai. Through a combination of humble apologies, clever excuses from Zhang Liang, and the sheer intimidating presence of Fan Kuai bursting into the feast to defend his master, Liu Bang managed to slip away during the confusion. This failure to act would haunt Zhang Yu forever, a missed opportunity to eliminate his most dangerous rival that showcased his fatal indecisiveness when faced with a personal appeal. The tide of war began to turn as Liu Bang, pushed into the remote hinterlands, patiently built his power base. While Zhang Yu was busy putting out fires from rebellious kings, Liu Bang's administrator Xiao, he was consolidating control over the agriculturally rich region of Shu, turning it into a powerhouse of resources. Liu Bang also proved masterful at psychological warfare, undermining Zhang Yu's support. When Zhang Yu cruelly executed the surrendered emperor of Qin and a popular rebel king, Liu Bang's propagandists painted him as a brutal tyrant. In contrast, Liu Bang issued a simple, three-point law to the people in territories he captured. Do not murder, do not injure, do not steal. This stark contrast between Qin-style brutality and his promise of stability won over a weary populace. The final act of their drama culminated in the year 202 B.C.E. at the Battle of Gaixia. Liu Bang, now commanding a massive coalition army, encircled Zhang Yu's forces. To break the spirit of the Chu soldiers, Zhang Liang devised a brilliant ruse. He had the Han soldiers sing folk songs from the Chu homeland. The sound of their own songs drifting across the night air convinced the Chu troops that their homeland had already been conquered and that their families were lost. Morale shattered, and Zhang Yu's army began to desert en masse. That night, surrounded and hearing the songs of Chu from all sides, Zhang Yu hosted his final farewell. He sang a desperate, mournful song to his beloved concubine, Yu Jai. My strength plucked up the hills, my might shadowed the world. But the times are against me, and Dapple runs no more. When Dapple runs no more, what then can I do? Ah, you, my Yu, what will your fate be? After singing, Yu Jai took a sword and killed herself to free him from his worry for her safety. The next morning, Zhang Yu made a final, desperate charge with his remaining 28 cavalry, cutting his way through thousands of Han soldiers before reaching the banks of the Wu River. A ferryman offered to take him back to Chu to regroup, but Zhang Yu refused. He stated he had no face to return to the elders of Chu, who had entrusted him with their sons, who now lay dead because of him. He fought his last stand, taking hundreds of enemy soldiers with him before ultimately taking his own life. His death was a profoundly tragic end, a fall so Shakespearean in its scale that it secured his place as a beloved, if flawed, hero in Chinese culture. Liu Bang's victory was total. He was proclaimed Emperor Geyazu of Han, founding a dynasty that would last for 400 years and become synonymous with Chinese cultural identity. His rise from peasant to emperor established a powerful new precedent, that the mandate of heaven could be earned by merit and popular support, not just inherited by noble birth. To govern, he and his successors created a system that blended the Qin's centralized bureaucracy with a more humane and pragmatic approach. They lowered taxes, relaxed the harsh legalist punishments, and most importantly, began to recruit talented men from across the empire to serve as officials. This was the nascent form of the meritocratic system that would later crystallize into the imperial examinations, creating a pathway for even the poorest scholar to rise to the highest levels of power based on his intellect and ability, not his lineage. The Han Dynasty did not just inherit an empire, it built a lasting civilization, and it was founded on the lesson learned from the clash between the noble aristocrat and the pragmatic commoner, that in the end, the ability to win the hearts of the people is the greatest power of all. While the Han Dynasty's founder, Emperor Geyazu, had secured the throne through pragmatic alliance and merciful rule, his successors inherited a kingdom still vulnerable to its most persistent and terrifying enemy, the nomadic Xingnu Confederation from the northern steppes. For decades, the Han policy had been one of appeasement, sending princesses and lavish tribute to the Xingnu Khans in a humiliating but necessary peace. This all changed with the ascendance of one of the most formidable rulers in Chinese history, Emperor Wu. His 54-year reign was not one of cautious maintenance, but of explosive, ambitious expansion, a period that would see the Han Empire stretch its boundaries to unprecedented lengths and redefine China's place in the world. Emperor Wu's first and most defining campaign was his lifelong war against the Xingnu. He recognized that the policy of appeasement was not only a drain on the treasury, but a permanent stain on imperial prestige. He was determined to break their power forever. To achieve this, he undertook a massive reorganization of the Han military, shifting from a defensive infantry-based force to a powerful, mobile cavalry that could meet the nomads on their own terms. He sent vast armies deep into the hostile steppes, led by brilliant generals like Wei Qing and Huo Quabang. These were not mere border skirmishes. They were grand, strategic offensives designed to seek out and destroy the Xingnu's main forces and secure crucial grazing lands. The cost was astronomical in both blood and treasure, but the victories were stunning. General Huo Quabang, a military prodigy, achieved legendary status by leading a force of light cavalry on a daring raid deep into Xingnu territory, where he reportedly performed a sacrifice to heaven on a mountain that now bore his name, symbolically claiming the land for the Han. These campaigns eventually pushed the Xingnu back across the Gobi Desert, securing the northern frontiers and allowing for the westward expansion of the Great Wall. Yet Emperor Wu's vision extended far beyond simple conquest. He understood that to truly defeat the Xingnu, he needed to outflank them diplomatically and economically. This strategic insight led to one of the most consequential diplomatic missions in ancient history, the journeys of Zhang Qian. The emperor tasked Zhang Qian with a daring mission: travel west through Xingnu-controlled territory to find and form an alliance with the Yuezhi people, who were ancient enemies of the Xingnu. Zhang Qian's expedition was a story of incredible hardship. He was captured by the Xingnu and held prisoner for a decade, marrying a Xingnu wife and having children, yet never abandoning his mission. He eventually escaped and, persevering through unimaginable trials, did indeed find the Yuezhi, though they had settled comfortably and had no interest in renewing a war. While he failed in his primary objective, Zhang Qian's return to court over 13 years after he left was a triumph of a different kind. He came back with meticulously detailed reports of the sophisticated civilizations to the west, the thriving urban centers of Fergana, Bactria, and Parthia. Most importantly, he described powerful horses from the Fergana Valley that were far superior to Han breeds, which he believed were the key to defeating the Xingnu cavalry. His reports opened the emperor's eyes to a world of untapped wealth and possibility beyond the deserts. Eager to acquire these heavenly horses and establish direct trade routes, Emperor Wu launched military campaigns to secure the Hexi Corridor, a vital stretch of land that connected China to Central Asia. This successful push opened the door for a steady flow of goods, ideas, and people, formally establishing the Silk Road. This network of routes became the ancient world's internet, connecting the Han Dynasty with Rome, India, and Persia, and facilitating an exchange that would shape global history for centuries. Funding these massive military and diplomatic undertakings required a complete overhaul of the Han economy. The endless campaigns were draining the state's coffers, and Emperor Wu, advised by his economic ministers, implemented a series of radical and controversial policies. He established state monopolies on two of the most essential commodities of the ancient world: salt and iron. Salt was indispensable for preserving food, and iron was critical for weaponry and farming tools. By taking control of their production and distribution, the state could generate an enormous, reliable stream of revenue independent of land taxes. This was not without fierce opposition. Scholars representing the Confucian agrarian ideal argued that the state should not compete with its people for profit, and that the monopolies led to inferior, overpriced goods. The state, however, prevailed, and the immense wealth generated from these monopolies directly financed the armies that expanded the empire and the diplomatic missions that opened the Silk Road. creating a powerful model of state capitalism that would be emulated for ages. In his later years, the emperor who had conquered so much of the earthly realm became consumed with a quest to conquer death itself. The relentless military campaigns had taken a heavy personal toll, and the death of his favorite concubine and his heir apparent in a brutal political purge plunged him into a deep despair. He turned away from the Confucian statecraft of his early reign and became intensely devoted to Taoist mystical practices and the pursuit of immortality. His court was filled with fangshi, or recipe masters, magicians who promised they could summon deities and concoct elixirs of eternal life. He sponsored lavish ceremonies and built elaborate towers to communicate with the spirit world. He even traveled multiple times to the eastern coast to make sacrifices to the gods and gaze out over the ocean, hoping to glimpse the mythical Pinglai Mountain, the island home of the immortals. This obsession made him vulnerable to court intrigues and costly deceptions, as charlatans took advantage of his fervent desire to cheat mortality. Emperor Wu's reign stands as a monumental paradox. He was a ruler of breathtaking vision and relentless drive who expanded China's borders, secured its frontiers, and integrated it into the wider world, laying foundations that would endure for 2,000 years. Yet his methods were brutally pragmatic, and his ambitions came at an almost incalculable human and financial cost. The endless wars and expensive projects exhausted the state's reserves and overburdened the peasantry, leading to widespread suffering and rebellion by the end of his life. He left behind an empire that was vastly larger and more powerful, but also deeply strained. His legacy is a complex tapestry of glorious achievement and profound consequence, a testament to the immense power and heavy price of imperial ambition. Yet for all the military might and economic power wielded by Emperor Wu, the struggle with the steppe confederations was never solely won on the battlefield. A quieter, more personal form of statecraft often operated in the shadows of grand strategy, one that traded the clash of swords for the subtle ties of marriage and diplomacy. This brings us to a story that has resonated for 2 millennia, not for its accounts of bloodshed, but for its poignant exploration of sacrifice, beauty, and the hidden human cost of empire. The tale of Wang Zetian, one of the 4 great beauties of ancient China, whose journey into the wilderness became a powerful national legend. Wang Qiang, later known to history as Zetian, was a woman of stunning beauty and refined intellect from the southern region of Ba. Selected for her qualities to enter the Han Imperial harem during the reign of Emperor Yuan, she found herself one among thousands of young women living in the secluded quarters of the palace. Life inside the harem was a gilded cage, a world of intense rivalry and quiet desperation. With the emperor unable to personally meet every consort, their official portraits were painted by court artists and presented to him for selection. This system placed immense power in the hands of the painters, and it was here that Wang Zetian's fate took its first tragic turn. The chief painter, Mao Yanchu, expected bribes from the palace ladies to enhance their portraits. Proud and principled, Zetian refused to pay, and in retaliation, the painter deliberately marred her portrait, adding a disfiguring mole beneath her eye that concealed her true beauty from the emperor and consigning her to years of lonely obscurity. The political context for her story unfolded far from the palace walls. In the 1st century BCE, the Xingnu Confederation, though weakened by Emperor Wu's campaigns, remained a powerful force. Hu Hanai, the Chanyu or ruler of the Xingnu, traveled to the Han court seeking to reaffirm a peace treaty through a time-honored practice known as Hekin, or harmony marriage. He asked for a Han princess to take as his wife, a union that would symbolically make him the emperor's son-in-law and cement an alliance. The emperor, eager to secure the northern frontier without another costly war, agreed to the request. However, no true princess of the blood was ever sent to the harsh frontier. Instead, the court selected a woman from the harem, bestowing upon her an honorary title. When the portraits were consulted for a candidate who would not be missed, the emperor, seeing the flawed painting of Wang Zetian, readily chose her. The legend reaches its most famous moment at the farewell audience. When Wang Zetian was presented to the emperor and the Xingnu chieftain, her true radiance was finally revealed. Dressed in finery, her beauty was so dazzling it seemed to light up the entire court. The emperor, stunned and filled with instant regret, realized he had been deceived by the painter. Historical accounts say he was utterly captivated, but the promise had been made before his entire court and a foreign ruler. To go back on his word would be a catastrophic diplomatic insult, likely shattering the fragile peace. Powerless to reclaim her, he could only watch as she was given to the Chanyu. In his fury, the emperor later had the dishonest painter Mao Yanchu executed for his deception, a grim footnote of justice that came far too late to change her destiny. Her journey north was immortalized in poetry and art, often depicted as a heartbreaking passage from civilization into barbarism. As she rode away from the familiar landscapes of China, the story goes that she took out a pipa, a lute, and began to play a mournful melody. The wild geese flying overhead, so stricken by her beauty and the sorrowful music, forgot to flap their wings and fell from the sky. This gave rise to the famous idiom, Loyan Zetian, to cause geese to fall and fish to sink, a phrase still used to describe breathtaking beauty. She married the Chanyu, had a son with him, and upon his death, faced another profound cultural shock. Following Xingnu custom, she was expected to marry her stepson, the new chieftain. She wrote a letter to the Han court begging to be allowed to return home, but the emperor, prioritizing the diplomatic alliance over her personal pleas, sent back a reply with a simple, devastating order: follow the custom of the Xingnu and work to strengthen the Han state. She complied, marrying again and having 2 daughters, her life forever bound to the duty of maintaining peace. Beyond the poignant legend, the practice of Hecken was a sophisticated, if cynical, tool of foreign policy. These marriages were a form of soft power, a strategic investment in stability. The princess sent to the steppes was more than a bride. She was a political agent, a permanent diplomatic envoy stationed within the enemy's court. She traveled with a lavish entourage of servants, advisors, and gift silks, grains, luxury goods, and agricultural tools that introduced elements of Han culture and technology to the nomads, fostering a degree of dependence and cultural exchange. Her presence created a familial link that made open aggression more politically complicated for the Xingnu leadership. For the Han treasury, a single marriage alliance was infinitely cheaper than mobilizing an army of 100,000 men and horses for a campaign into the treacherous north. It was a calculated gamble, trading a single life for the potential of years of peace along a vast and vulnerable frontier. In the centuries that followed, Wang Zhejian's story was endlessly retold and reimagined, each generation projecting its own values and anxieties onto her narrative. For poets and playwrights, she became the ultimate symbol of tragic beauty and virtuous sacrifice. She was portrayed as a noble woman who gave up her homeland for the greater good, a passive victim of a deceitful painter and the cold machinations of state. During times of national weakness, particularly under foreign dynasties like the Mongol-led Yuan or the Manchu-led Qing, her story resonated deeply as a melancholic exploration of Han cultural identity and the personal cost of subjugation. Yet, modern interpretations have begun to challenge this passive view, asking whether her legacy might be seen through a different lens. Rather than merely a pawn, could she be considered one of China's most successful diplomats? Her marriages ensured decades of peace between the Han and Xingnu, saving countless lives that would have been lost in war. Her story, therefore, stands at a complex crossroads, a timeless legend of personal loss that also reveals the intricate and often overlooked role women played in the grand, unsentimental theater of empire building, where the bonds of marriage could sometimes prove as decisive as the strength of armies. Yet the grand edifice of the Han dynasty, for all its Silk Road splendor and military might, was not immune to the ancient cycle of decline. As the Western Han drew to a close, the throne was increasingly occupied by child emperors, their power wielded by regents and empress dowagers from the powerful Wang family. From this environment of fading imperial authority emerged a figure of immense ambition and profound contradiction, Wang Mang. He was no rough-hewn warrior or rebel general, but a Confucian scholar official, a man who meticulously cultivated an image of supreme virtue, austerity, and devotion to the classical rites. His rise was a masterclass in political theater, a slow and patient climb that saw him lauded as the Duke who brings peace and the acting emperor, all while he systematically dismantled the dynasty he claimed to serve. He presented himself not as a usurper, but as a restorer, a virtuous sage who would return China to the legendary golden age of the Zhou dynasty that Confucius so admired. His eventual seizure of the throne in the year 9 CE, ending the Western Han, was not met with immediate rebellion, but with a wave of intellectual hope. Here, finally, was a philosopher king, a man who would rule by the sacred texts rather than by caprice. Once in power, Wang Mang unleashed a whirlwind of radical reforms, a sweeping top-down revolution based entirely on his scholarly interpretation of ancient Zhou dynasty texts. He declared all land the property of the state and ordered its redistribution to peasant families, abolishing the private ownership that had allowed powerful aristocrats to build vast estates. He outlawed the buying and selling of slaves, a move aimed at curbing the power of the wealthy. Most dizzyingly, he engaged in a complete overhaul of the currency system. He abolished the standard Han Wuzhou coins and introduced a baffling array of 28 new currencies, crafted from gold, silver, tortoise shell, and cowrie shell, with wildly unrealistic exchange rates between them. His motivations were purely ideological. He was attempting to recreate the monetary systems described in the ancient classics, with no regard for the practicalities of a complex economy. The result was instant and catastrophic confusion. Trade seized up, merchants went bankrupt, and widespread counterfeiting flourished as people clung to the old, trusted coins. The economy, the lifeblood of the empire, plunged into chaos. These man-made crises were swiftly compounded by a series of natural disasters of biblical proportions, events that the people and the scholarly class interpreted as the clearest possible sign from heaven. The Yellow River, the notoriously unpredictable Sorrow of China, dramatically changed its course in a massive flood, wiping out countless farms and creating waves of starving refugees. This was followed by immense locust swarms that blackened the skies and devoured what little crops remained in the Central Plains. Famine gripped the land, and with it came disease. In the Confucian worldview that Wang Mang himself espoused, such calamities were not random acts of nature. They were direct reflections of the emperor's loss of virtue, a withdrawal of the mandate of heaven. The very disasters he was trying to manage became the primary evidence for his illegitimacy. His attempts to respond issuing more confusing currency, ordering more rigid price controls, only deepened the suffering and the conviction that he had lost the way. As desperation turned to rage, the first sparks of rebellion ignited. They began not with the disgruntled Han aristocracy, but with the most oppressed and hopeless of his subjects, the starving peasants. In the Shandong Peninsula, a mother forced to watch her children die of hunger is said to have become the catalyst for the Red Eyebrows Rebellion. This massive uprising was named for the mark its fighters used to distinguish themselves, red paint smeared across their foreheads. They were a desperate, leaderless horde, fighting for survival rather than any political cause. Simultaneously, a more potent threat emerged from the Han Imperial clan, the Liu family, who had been pushed from power. Members of the clan, notably Liu Ziu, a brilliant and pragmatic strategist, began raising armies with the explicit goal of restoring the Han dynasty. They skillfully harnessed the popular discontent, positioning themselves as the rightful restorers of heaven's order against the failed experiment of the usurper. Wang Mang's final days were a descent into delusion and desperation. As rebel armies closed in on his capital at Chang'an, he reportedly retreated into a world of magical rituals and desperate appeals to the heavens. He led the officials of his court in a continuous ceremony, weeping and kowtowing to the sky, begging for divine intervention. He even constructed a fantastical contraption supposed to harness the power of the stars, a last, futile attempt to prove he still possessed the mandate. It was too late. In the year 23 CE, the rebels stormed the city. Wang Mang died in the ensuing chaos, though the exact manner of his death is shrouded in grisly legend. Some accounts say he was killed in battle at the palace gates. Others claim he was beheaded by a merchant he had ruined, and his head was paraded through the streets before being stored in the Imperial treasury as a macabre trophy, and warning to future usurpers. His brief Xin dynasty died with him, a 15-year interlude of ideological fervor that collapsed under the weight of its own impracticality and the unforgiving judgment of heaven and earth. His ultimate legacy is one of history's great cautionary tales. Wang Mang stands as a stark warning of the chasm that can exist between scholarly idealism and practical governance. He was a man who tried to build a utopia using 2,000-year-old blueprints, attempting to force a living, breathing society into the rigid confines of a text. His story demonstrates the immense danger of implementing radical theory without any consideration for human nature or economic reality. For later Confucian historians, he became a complex and troubling figure, one of their own who had catastrophically failed. He forced a long and difficult reckoning within Confucian thought about the limits of applying classical ideals in a changing world. And for the restored Han dynasty that followed, his bloody downfall served as a powerful object lesson, that the mandate of heaven could be lost as dramatically by a bookish reformer as by a decadent tyrant, and that no amount of ritual correctness could substitute for the basic ability to keep the people fed and the rivers in their courses. Beyond the watchtowers of the Jade Gate, the promise of unimaginable wealth drew merchants and adventurers onto a ribbon of trails known collectively as the Silk Road. This was no single, paved highway, but a shifting network of tracks connecting the Han Empire to the distant Roman world. For those who dared the journey, it offered a chance at fortunes that could elevate an entire family for generations. A single bolt of silk, lighter than a breeze and more precious than gold, could be traded in Parthia or Rome for a king's ransom. But this path to riches was also a gauntlet of terror, a test of human endurance against some of the most unforgiving geography on the planet. The first and most formidable barrier was the Taklamakan Desert, a vast basin of shifting sand dunes encircled by towering mountain ranges. Its name, passed down through generations of travelers, was a chilling warning in the Eiger tongue: enter, and you will not come out. This was not a place of mere hardship, it was an active and malevolent force. Sandstorms could erupt without warning, swallowing entire caravans in a suffocating, abrasive darkness, scouring the flesh from bones and leaving no trace behind. The shifting dunes themselves would erase paths overnight, turning reliable routes into trackless death traps. And perhaps most terrifying of all were the mirage's visions of shimmering lakes and inviting groves of trees that would lure parched travelers off their course and deeper into the void. A cruel trick of the light and the mind that sealed the fate of countless souls. The desert did not just kill, it made people disappear, leaving behind only silent, sun-bleached bones and the haunting question of what treasures they had been carrying. To survive this hellscape, trade did not move in a single, continuous line. It hopped like a stone skimming across water, from one oasis town to the next. These small settlements, clinging to life at the desert's edge, became the vital lifelines of the Silk Road. Melting snow from the Kunlun and Tianshan mountains fed these islands of green, where dates, grapes, and melons grew in abundance. Towns like Kashgar, Cotton, and Dunhuang grew wealthy and powerful not from producing goods, but from the sheer act of facilitation. They were the ancient world's customs houses, markets, and caravanserais all in one. Here, a merchant from Chang'an could sell his silk to a Sogdian middleman, who would then negotiate its passage with Parthian traders, who would ultimately transport it to the Roman frontier. This relay system meant that very few individuals ever traveled the entire length of the road, but ideas and cultures made the entire journey, passed from hand to hand. These oasis towns became vibrant melting pots where Zoroastrian fire temples stood beside Hindu shrines, and where languages, art, and culinary traditions blended into something entirely new. The murals in the Magao caves near Dunhuang, funded by grateful merchants who had survived the desert crossing, testify to this incredible cultural fusion, depicting bodhisattvas with Indian features, Chinese dress, and Persian halos. Amidst the trade in tangible goods, the most enduring commodity to travel east was not a thing, but a thought. The spiritual hunger of the Han people, particularly following the social upheavals and collapse of Wang Mang's Xin dynasty, created a fertile ground for new ideas. It was through these Central Asian trade routes that Buddhism first whispered its way into China, carried not by conquering armies, but by humble monks and merchants. The first Buddhist texts likely arrived in the luggage of traders from the Kushan Empire, translated by Parthian and Sogdian monks in the bustling oasis markets. This early form of Buddhism was heavily influenced by Greco-Buddhist art from Gandhara and mingled with Taoist and mystical concepts already familiar to the Chinese, making it more accessible. The appeal was profound. Its core teachings on suffering, karma, and release from the cycle of rebirth offered a powerful explanation for the chaos and pain of the mortal world, providing a solace that traditional Confucian statecraft could not. It promised a path to personal salvation that was open to all, from the emperor in his palace to the common farmer tilling his field. This slow, peaceful absorption of a foreign philosophy would eventually transform Chinese civilization, influencing its art, philosophy, language, and governance for the next 2,000 years, all thanks to the cultural currents that flowed along the merchant routes. For the Roman Empire, whose wealthy patricians were mad for the luxurious cloth, silk was a source of both wonder and deep economic anxiety. The Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder lamented the vast sums of gold and silver that flowed east to pay for it, calling it a drain on the empire's wealth. They knew the silk came from a mysterious people called the seers, but they had fantastical ideas about its origin. Some believed it grew on trees as a kind of vegetable wool, while others thought it was combed from the leaves of a special plant. The Chinese guarded the secret of sericulture with the utmost severity. The production of silk, from the cultivation of mulberry trees to the careful rearing of silkworms and the complex process of reeling the delicate thread, was a state secret. Revealing it to any foreigner was punishable by death. This monopoly allowed the Han Dynasty to control the most valuable luxury good in the ancient world, creating a consistent trade surplus that poured wealth into the empire and funded its military expansion and cultural projects. The secret was so well kept that it remained a mystery to the West for centuries, a testament to the effectiveness of Chinese protectionism and the immense value they placed on this incredible invention. The great secret, however, could not stay contained forever. The story of how it left China is shrouded in legend, centering on a Central Asian kingdom desperate for the knowledge. According to the account of the 6th century historian Procopius, the Christian monks of the Byzantine Emperor Justinian successfully hatched an audacious plan. They had reportedly traveled to the land of the seers and learned the art of silk production. Recognizing the immense value, they promised the emperor they could bring the secret to him. The story goes that these monks, who were also skilled in espionage, hollowed out their walking staffs and smuggled out silkworm eggs and the seeds of the mulberry tree, delivering them to Constantinople around 552 CE. Another version points to a Chinese princess, betrothed to a king of cotton around the year 440 CE. Unwilling to part with her luxurious silk garments, she supposedly hid silkworm eggs and mulberry seeds in her elaborate headdress, smuggling them past the border guards to gift the technology to her new homeland. While the exact truth is lost to time, these legends highlight a crucial truth. Despite the Han Dynasty's draconian efforts, knowledge is a fluid thing, impossible to contain completely within borders. The lure of silk's power was so great that it inspired missions of industrial espionage worthy of any modern thriller, ultimately breaking China's monopoly and forever changing the economic landscape of Eurasia. The collapse of the Han Dynasty did not lead to a quiet period of mourning, but instead unleashed an age of such intense drama, personal loyalty, and grand strategy that it would become the most celebrated and romanticized period in all of Chinese history. This was the era of the Three Kingdoms, a sprawling, chaotic, and brutal civil war that pitted three rival states, Wei, Shu, and Wu against each other in a 60-year struggle for supremacy. While the historical reality was one of famine, death, and relentless political maneuvering, the stories that emerged from this time have been elevated into a national epic, a timeless narrative of heroism, cunning, and tragic ambition that continues to captivate audiences centuries later. At the heart of this epic are figures who have transcended history to become archetypes. Cao Cao, the formidable leader of the northern state of Wei, is perhaps the most complex. Historically, he was a brilliant administrator and military genius who stabilized the north and laid the groundwork for eventual reunification. Yet, in the popular tradition cemented by the classic novel Romance of the Three Kingdoms, he is often portrayed as the ultimate villain, a cunning, ruthless, and suspicious tyrant whose famous motto, "I would rather betray the world than let the world betray me," encapsulates his Machiavellian worldview. This duality makes him fascinating. He was a poet who wrote movingly about the suffering of war, yet he could order the massacre of civilians without hesitation. He represents raw, pragmatic power, unburdened by the need for moral justification. Arrayed against him is the tragic hero, Liu Bei, the paternalistic leader of the southwestern state of Shu Han. Claiming distant descent from the Han Imperial family, he built his legitimacy not on military might, but on a carefully cultivated reputation for benevolence, righteousness, and unwavering loyalty to his friends. His story is a classic underdog tale, often forced to flee, relying on the generosity of rivals, and repeatedly facing devastating losses. He persevered through the strength of his character and his ability to inspire fierce devotion. His most iconic relationships were with his sworn brothers, the mighty warrior Guan Yu and the fierce general Zhang Fei. Their oath in a peach garden to fight and die for one another became the ultimate symbol of brotherly loyalty in Chinese culture, a bond so sacred it was said to be stronger than life itself. Completing the triumvirate was Sun Quan, the master of the southeastern state of Wu. While less flashy than his rivals, Sun Quan was a master of survival. He inherited a territory from his elder brother and skillfully navigated the conflict between Wei and Shu, playing them off against each other to maintain his independence. His greatest strength was his ability to recognize and employ talented individuals, building a powerful coalition of advisors and generals who were fiercely loyal to him. His decision-making was often cautious and pragmatic, focused on securing his river-based kingdom and expanding southward. He represents the third path, not the conqueror like Cao Cao, nor the righteous restorer like Liu Bei, but the savvy ruler who protects his own and endures. The battles of this era have become the stuff of legend, studied for their tactical brilliance and sheer scale. The Battle of Red Cliffs in the winter of 208 C. He stands above all others, facing Cao Cao's massive fleet, said to number nearly 800,000 men. The outnumbered forces of Sun Quan and Liu Bei devised an ingenious plan. Their strategist, Zhu Yu, feigned surrender to get close to Cao Cao's ships, which were chained together to combat seasickness. Then, using a sudden shift in the wind, they launched a fleet of fire ships vessels packed with dry reeds and oil straight into the heart of the enemy fleet. The resulting inferno destroyed Cao Cao's navy and turned the tide of the war, ensuring that China would remain divided into 3 states for decades to come. This victory was a masterpiece of deception, understanding the environment, and exploiting a single critical weakness. No discussion of strategy is complete without Zhu Ziliang, the legendary chancellor of Shu, often called the Sleeping Dragon. His reputation as a near-mythical strategist, soothsayer, and inventor is largely a product of later literature, but it has cemented his place as the ultimate wise advisor. The romance attributes to him one brilliant stratagem after another, borrowing arrows from the enemy by sending out straw-filled boats on a foggy morning, manipulating the winds through arcane rituals, and deploying repeating crossbows and mechanical transport devices. His most famous act was his empty fort strategy, where, with his army away, he calmly sat atop the gate of a vulnerable city playing his lute, successfully tricking an advancing enemy general into believing the deserted town was actually a deadly ambush. These stories, while almost certainly fictional, capture the Chinese admiration for intellect over brute force, for winning through wisdom and psychological insight rather than mere strength of arms. So where does the history end and the legend begin? The primary source, the records of the Three Kingdoms by Chen Shu, is a relatively sober historical account written shortly after the period ended. The epic we know today is overwhelmingly shaped by the 14th century novel Romance of the Three Kingdoms, written by Liu Guanzhong. Liu took the historical framework and infused it with a clear moral compass, popular folklore, and dramatic intensification. He amplified the virtues of Liu Bei and Zhu Ziliang into near-saintly perfection, while deepening the cunning of Cao Cao into outright villainy. He created iconic scenes, like Shang scaring away an army with a mighty roar at a bridge, that have no basis in the historical record, but are essential to the story's power. This process was a form of national myth-making, creating a narrative that explored core Chinese values like loyalty, wisdom, and the mandate of heaven. The enduring appeal of the Three Kingdoms lies in this very blend of history and myth. It provides a grand stage for exploring every facet of the human condition: ambition, loyalty, betrayal, genius, and folly. Its characters are not simple. They are complex, flawed, and deeply human. We see ourselves in their struggles. The stories have been retold in countless operas, films, television series, video games, and comics, each adaptation finding new relevance for a new generation. It is a tale that asks, what does it mean to be a good ruler, a loyal friend, a brilliant mind? The Three Kingdoms offers no easy answers, but provides a breathtakingly rich tapestry of human drama against which to ask the questions, ensuring its heroes and villains will never be forgotten. Yet for all the grand narratives of conquest and betrayal that defined the age of the Three Kingdoms, a quieter, more subtle form of rebellion was taking root in the shadows of the imperial court. As the mighty houses of Cao, Liu, and Sun clashed for control of all under heaven, the constant political purges and savage shifts in power created an atmosphere of intense paranoia and danger for the educated elite. For every brilliant strategist like Zhu Ziliang who found a lord to serve, there were countless scholars and officials who found themselves caught in the machinations of ruthless regimes, their lives hanging by a thread. It was from this pressure cooker of anxiety and disillusionment that one of the most iconic and romanticized intellectual movements in Chinese history was born, a retreat not to mountains or monasteries, but into a bamboo grove, with a jar of wine and the pursuit of pure, untrammeled spontaneity. This is the story of the 7 sages of the Bamboo Grove. The group's formation was a direct response to the treacherous political climate, particularly in the state of Wei, which was increasingly coming under the control of the powerful Sima family. The sages were not formal members of a school or institution, but a loose-knit circle of close friends who shared a profound disillusionment with the corrupt world of officialdom. They sought refuge in a country estate near the capital, Luoyang, which was famed for its beautiful bamboo groves. Here, they could escape the stifling rituals and deadly intrigues of the court, embracing instead a life dedicated to art, music, profound conversation, and, most famously, copious amounts of wine. Their gatherings were less like philosophical seminars and more like intellectual jam sessions, where the lines between discourse, drunken revelry, and sublime artistic creation were deliberately blurred. While there were 7 core members, a few stand out for their defining eccentricities and legendary contributions. Jai Kang, perhaps the most famous of the sages, was a towering figure, a brilliant philosopher, a master lute player, and a man of unshakable integrity. He was offered a high official post, but refused in a famously scathing letter, a letter declining official post from Shan Jiayuan, which became a manifesto for intellectual independence. In it, he listed 9 reasons he could not serve, including his love of sleeping late, his dislike of being around crowds, and his inability to stop himself from criticizing his superiors. This was more than just laziness. It was a philosophical stance against the rigid, hypocritical Confucian rituals that governed public life. His defiance, however, would ultimately cost him his life. His enemies at court, infuriated by his arrogance and influence, eventually had him executed on trumped-up charges. As he walked to his death, he remained utterly composed, asking for his lute and playing his masterpiece, Guangling San, one final time before calmly stating, "Guangling San dies with me." His closest friend, Yuan Jai, processed the same darkness in a different way. A gifted poet, he is best known for his series of 82 poems titled Singing of My Thoughts. These works are masterpieces of political allegory, veiling his deep sorrow and bitter criticism of the regime in layers of obscure historical allusion and natural imagery, allowing him to express his dissent without providing his enemies with a clear pretext for accusation. To further protect himself, he adopted a public persona of extreme drunkenness. It is said that he could stay drunk for weeks at a time to avoid being forced to make political commitments. On one occasion, when the court needed a complimentary document drafted, they sought him out only to find him in a wine-soaked stupor. They propped him up, and he dictated the text perfectly in one go, earning the needed praise without ever sobering up or officially engaging with the power structure he despised. Another member, Liu Ling, took the celebration of wine to its most extreme and humorous conclusion. He was known for often wandering around his house completely naked. When visitors expressed their shock, he would retort, "I take the whole universe as my house and my own room as my clothing. Why, then, do you enter here into my trousers?" He even had a servant follow him with a jug of wine and a shovel, instructing the man to bury him wherever he happened to fall dead. For Liu Ling, this was the ultimate expression of freedom from societal norms and concerns about legacy or posterity. His antics, while absurd, were a performance art designed to showcase a life lived entirely in the present moment, without regard for the judgment of others. The philosophy that bound these eccentric individuals together was a particular interpretation of Taoism known as Chuang Tzu, or dark learning, or profound studies. While traditional Taoism, as expressed in the De Jing, focused on the art of rulership and harmony with the natural order, the seven sages applied these principles to the art of personal survival and spiritual freedom. They emphasized the concept of zuren, or spontaneous naturalness, arguing that true virtue was found not in following artificial social conventions, but in embracing one's authentic, unfiltered self. Their excessive drinking was not mere decadence, it was a tool for achieving this spontaneity. Wine was seen as a medium that could dissolve the ego, break down the social conditioning imposed by a corrupt world, and allow one's true nature to emerge, raw and uninhibited. The legacy of the seven sages of the bamboo grove is immense and complex. On one hand, they have been romanticized for centuries as the ultimate symbols of the free spirit, the artist who refuses to bow to power. Their image has been endlessly depicted in paintings, poetry, and ceramics, often showing them reclining lazily beneath the bamboo, a wine cup in hand, embodying an ideal of cultured withdrawal. They became the model for the Chinese scholar recluse, a figure who chooses a life of quiet contemplation and artistic pursuit over the sordid struggle for political power. Yet, there is also a deep undercurrent of tragedy in their story. Their rebellion was ultimately a defensive one, born of fear and powerlessness. Their embrace of spontaneity was, in part, a carefully calculated performance to avoid the executioner's blade. They demonstrated that in a world where speaking truth to power could mean death, the only free space left might be the one you create yourself, among friends, in a grove of bamboo, with the protective haze of wine allowing you to say what you really mean without ever having to say it directly. They proved that sometimes the most powerful form of protest is not a shouted slogan, but a whispered poem, a strummed chord, or a shared, knowing silence between friends who understand the price of freedom. The stability so painstakingly rebuilt by the Sima family's Jin dynasty proved to be a fragile illusion, a magnificent palace built atop a seismic fault. The very policy they had used to secure their borders, settling large populations of non-Chinese nomadic tribes within northern China, would become the instrument of their catastrophic downfall. For decades, the Xingnu, Jai, Xianbei, Dai, and Qiang peoples, collectively known as the Five Barbarians, had lived inside the empire's frontiers. They served as auxiliary troops in the Jin armies and worked as laborers, but they remained a distinct underclass, often exploited and treated with contempt by the Han Chinese elite. The Jin court believed they had successfully tamed these formidable warriors, but they had merely brought the volatility of the steppe into the very heart of their civilization, and then, through a brutal civil war known as the War of the Eight Princes, shattered the central authority needed to control it. The spark that ignited the tinderbox was a decision by the Jin emperor to deny a powerful Xingnu chieftain, named Liu Yuan, a command in the civil war. Feeling insulted and seeing the perfect opportunity in the dynasty's self-inflicted weakness, Liu Yuan made a revolutionary declaration. He did not claim to be a rebel. He proclaimed himself the rightful heir to the Chinese imperial tradition. tracing a direct lineage back to the Han Dynasty through ancient marriage alliances and declaring his own state of Han, later renamed Zhao. This was a masterstroke of political legitimacy. He was no longer a barbarian chieftain leading a tribal revolt. He was a contender for the mandate of heaven, using the very language and symbols of the Chinese throne to justify his rule. His call to arms resonated with many disaffected Han Chinese who were already suffering under the corrupt and fractious Jin princes. What followed was not a single rebellion, but a cascading series of them, a multi-sided free-for-all that historians would later term the uprising of the Five Barbarians. The process was one of utter devastation. Between the years 304 and 316, one nomadic army after another swept through North China. Cities that had stood for centuries were put to the torch. Luoyang, the magnificent capital of the Jin, was sacked in 311. The Xingnu forces captured the emperor, forcing him to act as a servant before eventually having him executed. The horrors of this period were seared into the historical record. It was an age of mass famine, rampant disease, and staggering loss of life, as the complex agricultural and administrative fabric of North China was torn apart. The surviving Jin aristocracy and what was left of the imperial court did the only thing they could. They fled. In a vast, desperate migration known as the Yiguan Nadu, or movement of robes and crowns southward, the elite of North China crossed the Yangtze River, abandoning their ancestral homes and tombs to establish a new, exiled Jin court in the southern city of Jiankang, modern-day Nanjing. This flight created a lasting geographical and political schism that would define the next 3 centuries. The South became the bastion of what considered itself The Chinese letter, or legitimate Orthodox Chinese succession. The Southern dynasties, beginning with the Eastern Jin, saw themselves as the direct heirs of Han and Jin culture, preserving the classical texts, the refined rituals, and the literary traditions. They built a delicate and often precarious society, a world of exquisite poetry, profound philosophical debates, and intense political intrigue amongst the great aristocratic clans who had escaped the north. The landscape itself was different, lush, watery, and fertile land. The culture began to absorb influences from the indigenous peoples of the south, creating a distinct southern Chinese identity. Meanwhile, the north was utterly transformed. It shattered into a constantly shifting mosaic of 16 different kingdoms, most ruled by non-Chinese dynasties of Xingnu, Xianbei, Dai, and Jai origin. This was not a simple story of barbarian destroyers versus Chinese victims. The reality was far more complex and fascinating. These nomadic conquerors found themselves rulers of a vast sedentary population with a sophisticated administrative system they did not know how to run. To govern, they had no choice but to rely on the very Han Chinese scholar officials whose world they had overturned. These officials, in turn, saw an opportunity to slowly civilize their new masters, to guide them toward the Confucian model of statecraft. The barbarian rulers, keenly aware of the prestige and power of Chinese imperial tradition, often actively encouraged this process. They issued law codes based on Chinese models, adopted Chinese court rituals, and began to patronize Buddhism, which, unlike the deeply ethnic Confucian tradition, offered a universalist ideology that could transcend the divide between conqueror and conquered. This cultural negotiation was a two-way street. While the northern rulers were adopting Chinese ways, their martial traditions and customs were also reshaping northern society. The easygoing aristocratic culture of the south had no place here. The north was a harder, more militarized world. The Wei Dynasty, founded by the Chuoba clan of the Xianbei people, became the most successful of these northern regimes. They implemented a radical policy known as the Fubing system, which organized the population into military colonies, creating a powerful army of farmer soldiers. They also moved their capital to the ancient Chinese city of Luoyang and embarked on a systematic program of Sinicization under the visionary Emperor Zetian. He decreed that his Xianbei people must adopt Chinese surnames, wear Chinese clothing, speak the Chinese language, and even intermarry with the Han Chinese elite. This was a top-down effort to erase the ethnic differences between ruler and ruled, and to create a new, unified northern identity. The result of this centuries-long crucible was not a victory of one culture over the other, but a profound synthesis. The new northern civilization that emerged was tougher, more pragmatic, and more devoutly Buddhist than its southern counterpart. It blended the martial vigor and cavalry tactics of the steppe with the bureaucratic sophistication and literary culture of China. This hybrid culture proved to be incredibly dynamic. It was from this fused northern tradition that the momentum for reunification would eventually come. The Sui and then the Tang dynasties, which finally ended the centuries of division, were both products of this mixed heritage. Their emperors descended from Xianbei and Chinese aristocratic lines. The Great Wall that had once separated Han from barbarian now stood in the middle of a reunified empire, a silent monument to a border that had been transcended not by military force alone, but by the slow, complex, and often painful process of two worlds becoming one. His extraordinary journey from capable ruler to devout monarch stands as one of history's most fascinating examples of how spiritual fervor can reshape an entire empire, for better and for worse. Initially, Emperor Wu's reign was a model of Confucian virtue and effective governance. He was a shrewd and energetic administrator who rose early, dressed plainly, and worked tirelessly to hear petitions and address the grievances of his people. He founded schools, promoted agriculture, and his court was a vibrant center of literary and cultural activity, attracting some of the brightest minds of the southern dynasties. He seemed poised to be remembered as a great restorer of order and culture. But beneath this conventional exterior, a profound spiritual transformation was taking root, one that would soon eclipse all his worldly ambitions and redefine his legacy entirely. This transformation found its focus in the teachings of Buddhism, which had been steadily gaining influence in China for centuries. For Emperor Wu, it was not merely a philosophy to be studied. It was a profound calling that demanded his complete and total devotion. He became convinced that the path to a truly righteous and peaceful kingdom lay not in Confucian statecraft or military might, but in the collective spiritual merit generated through Buddhist practice. This belief launched a breathtaking campaign of religious patronage on a scale never before seen. He poured the state's treasury into constructing temples, funding the translation of sutras, and supporting a rapidly expanding monastic community. The capital, Jiankang, became a city of soaring pagodas and the constant, resonant chanting of monks. Historical accounts claim he built over 500 temples within the city walls alone, each one a monument to his piety and a massive drain on the imperial coffers. His most famous and politically disruptive act was his personal adoption of the monastic life not once, but on 4 separate occasions. In a carefully staged ritual of humility, the Son of Heaven would divest himself of his imperial robes, don the simple saffron garments of a monk, and enter a temple to devote himself to prayer and study. This created an immediate and profound constitutional crisis. The emperor was the linchpin of the entire state apparatus. Without him, the business of government ground to a complete halt. Panicked ministers and court officials were left with no choice but to formally approach the monastic community and offer staggering donations from the state treasury to effectively ransom their emperor back to the throne. These donations, amounting to hundreds of millions of coins each time, were a clever, if bizarre, mechanism for funneling vast sums of public wealth directly into the Buddhist Sangha, enriching the monasteries while beggaring the state. This blurring of lines between spiritual devotion and civic responsibility had severe consequences. The government's finances were stretched to the breaking point by his endless donations and construction projects. Meanwhile, the monastic community, granted tax-exempt status and vast landholdings, grew immensely wealthy and powerful. This created significant social friction, as peasant families saw their young men and women drawn to the economic security of monastic life, depriving the state of both tax-paying citizens and conscripts for the army. Emperor Wu's singular focus on accumulating spiritual merit also led him to adopt a strict pacifist stance, refusing to authorize military campaigns even when necessary for the defense of the realm. He believed the power of Buddhist virtue and the mantras chanted by his monks would provide a more potent defense than any army, a conviction that would soon be put to a catastrophic test. That test arrived in the form of a rebellion led by the general Hu Jing, a former northern warlord who had defected to the Liang. A cunning and ruthless opportunist, Hu Jing sensed the empire's weakness beneath its pious veneer. When a diplomatic dispute provided a pretext, he turned his army against his benefactor. The subsequent rebellion exposed the hollow core of Emperor Wu's devout kingdom. The much-vaunted spiritual defenses proved utterly useless against the reality of steel and siege engines. Hu Jing's forces laid waste to the countryside and eventually besieged the capital itself. Even as the city starved and his people suffered unimaginably, the elderly emperor, isolated in his palace, reportedly continued to hold Buddhist lectures and discussions on the finer points of doctrine, seemingly detached from the collapsing world around him. The fall of Jiankang was a moment of profound tragedy and historical irony. The great patron of Buddhism, the emperor who had built a forest of temples, was left to languish as a prisoner in his own palace. The histories say Hu Jing slowly deprived him of food and comforts until the 85-year-old monarch, abandoned by all but a handful of servants, died of hunger and despair. His passing marked not just the end of his life, but the end of his dynasty and the southern era of cultural flourishing he had helped create. Emperor Wu of Liang's story endures as a powerful and complex cautionary tale. It speaks to the immense magnetic pull of faith and the human desire to transcend worldly suffering. Yet it also stands as a sobering reminder of the dangers that arise when a leader becomes so captivated by the promise of the next world that they neglect the urgent and often messy responsibilities of this one, ultimately sacrificing his kingdom on the altar of his own devotion. Yet from the ashes of the southern dynasties and the hardened, hybrid culture of the north, a new force was gathering strength, one that would finally break the centuries-long stalemate and hammer China back into a single, cohesive empire. The agent of this monumental change was the Sui dynasty, a brief, blazing flash of immense ambition and catastrophic overreach that fundamentally reshaped the geography and destiny of China. Its founders, Emperor Wen and his son Emperor Yang, were men of starkly contrasting legacies, one a paragon of frugal consolidation, the other a byword for extravagant folly. Together, they would build an empire of astonishing scale, and then watch it crumble under the weight of its own ambition, all within the span of a single generation. The Sui's rise to power began not with a peasant revolt, but with a palace coup rooted in the unique cultural fusion of the North. The founding emperor, Yang Jian, later known as Emperor Wen, was a high-ranking general of mixed Xianbei and Han Chinese descent from the aristocratic elite of the Northern Zhou dynasty. He married a Xianbei princess from an equally powerful family, and through a combination of military success, strategic marriages, and ruthless political maneuvering, he positioned himself as regent for a child emperor. In 581, he completed his carefully laid plans, deposing the boy and declaring himself emperor of a new dynasty, the Sui. His claim to legitimacy was powerful. He presented himself as a champion of Han Chinese culture and a Buddhist ruler, a unifying figure who could bridge the divide between the steppe traditions of the northern military and the Confucian Chinese letter, or bureaucracy of the south. His reign was a masterclass in efficient, pragmatic statecraft. He implemented the equal field system to redistribute land to peasants, breaking the power of great landowners and ensuring stable tax revenue. He centralized the administration, standardizing laws and reviving the Confucian examination system to recruit officials based on merit rather than birth. He was famously frugal, and his treasury swelled with the wealth of a reunited and efficiently managed state. In 589, he completed his life's work, launching a massive naval campaign down the Yangtze River that finally conquered the last of the southern dynasties, the Chen, thereby reuniting China for the first time in nearly 300 years. With the empire politically unified, Emperor Wen's son and successor, Emperor Yang, undertook the even more daring task of binding it together physically and economically. His vision was nothing less than the complete re-engineering of China's landscape through the construction of the Grand Canal, one of the most ambitious civil engineering projects in human history up to that point. This was not a single canal, but a vast network of new and upgraded waterways linking the fertile rice baskets of the lower Yangtze River Valley with the political and military centers of the arid north. Millions of conscripted laborers, including women and children, were forced into this backbreaking work, dredging rivers and digging canals by hand with little more than baskets and shovels. The human cost was astronomical. Historical records, likely exaggerated but indicative of immense suffering, suggest that up to 40% of the 6 million workers may have perished from exhaustion, disease, and malnutrition. The finished system was a marvel. It connected the Yellow River and the Yangtze, creating a 2,000-mile aquatic highway that allowed the tax grain, salt, and silk of the South to be efficiently transported to feed the armies and officials in the northern capitals of Luoyang and Chang'an. It wasn't just an economic artery, it was a central nervous system for the empire, enabling the Sui and later dynasties to project power and maintain cultural cohesion across vast distances. The Grand Canal would become Emperor Yang's most enduring legacy, a foundational project that underpinned China's economic prosperity for the next millennium. Yet the same relentless drive that built the canal also fueled Emperor Yang's ruinous ambitions abroad. Secure in his newly unified and seemingly inexhaustible empire, he turned his gaze northeast to the Korean kingdom of Goguryeo. The reasons for the campaigns were a mix of strategy, ego, and a desire to restore the glory of the Han Dynasty's frontiers. Goguryeo was a powerful, independent state that had successfully resisted northern dynasties for centuries, and Emperor Yang was determined to subdue it. Between 612 and 614, he launched 3 massive invasions, each larger and more disastrous than the last. The first campaign was a catastrophe of historic proportions. He personally led a force historians estimate at over 1 million men, supported by a vast navy. The campaign was a logistical nightmare, plagued by terrible weather, staunch Korean resistance led by the brilliant General Yulji Mundiak, and devastating ambushes. The Sui army was lured deep into Korean territory and then annihilated. Records claim only 2,700 men survived out of an initial 300,000-strong vanguard force. Humiliated, Emperor Yang raised yet another colossal army, but the second and third campaigns fared no better, collapsing due to mutinies and the escalating chaos back home. The cost of these projects and wars was more than the empire could bear. The treasury was emptied, and the endless demands for conscripted labor and soldiers tore millions of men from their farms, leading to widespread famine and despair. The emperor, oblivious to the suffering or arrogantly dismissive of it, continued to live in staggering opulence, building lavish palaces and undertaking extravagant tours of his domain via the very canal his people had built with their blood. The resentment finally boiled over into open rebellion. Peasant uprisings erupted across the country, and disaffected members of the elite, seeing the dynasty's weakness, began to raise their own armies. China, so recently reunited, was plunged into chaos once more. Emperor Yang, realizing his dream had turned to ash, retreated to his southern capital in Jiangdu, where he reportedly spent his final days in a state of delusion and despair, admiring himself in a mirror and lamenting what a fine head he had, wondering who would eventually cut it off. In 618, his answer came. He was assassinated by his own ministers, and the Sui dynasty, which had reunified China with such brilliant promise, collapsed under the weight of its own imperial overreach. From the resulting power vacuum emerged a new dynasty, the Tang, which would learn from the Sui's fatal mistakes, harnessing the incredible infrastructure it built while tempering its ambition with wiser statecraft, ushering in a true golden age. The Sui's lesson was stark and clear. Even the grandest vision is unsustainable if it is built upon the broken backs of the people. Out of the bloody chaos that consumed the Sui, a new power swiftly emerged, one that would learn from its predecessors' fatal flaws to build an era so glorious it would become the benchmark for all Chinese dynasties to come. The story of the Tang's founding is a classic drama of aristocratic ambition, where a trusted guardian of the old order recognizes a moment of terminal weakness and seizes the throne for himself. Lai Yuan, the Duke of Tang, was a high-ranking Sui official and a cousin to the emperor, with deep family roots in the powerful military aristocracy of the north. a lineage that blended Chinese and Xianbei blood. Stationed in the strategic northern city of Taiyuan to guard against Turkic incursions, he watched as Emperor Yang's disastrous policies ignited rebellions across the land. The pivotal moment arrived not from his own ambition, but from the daring of his brilliant second son, Lai Shimin. Fearing his father's hesitation would doom the family, Lai Shimin and a group of conspirators devised a plan to force Lai Yuan's hand. The most colorful account describes them getting Lai Yuan drunk, then arranging for him to spend the night with a consort of the absent Emperor Yang, a capital offense that left him with no honorable retreat. With his options reduced to rebellion or execution, Lai Yuan finally agreed. Raising his army in Taiyuan, he marched on the Sui capital, Shang, promising order and stability to a war-weary populace. The gates were opened to him, and in 618, with the Sui emperor recently assassinated, Lai Yuan proclaimed himself Emperor Gaiazu, founder of the Tang Dynasty. But securing the throne was only the beginning. The true struggle for power was about to erupt within the new imperial family itself. The classic Confucian principle of primogeniture designated Lai Jiancheng, the eldest son, as the crown prince. Lai Yuan, as founder, naturally upheld this tradition. Lai Shimin, however, was the undeniable architect of the rebellion and its greatest military hero. Throughout the early years of the dynasty, it was Shimin who led the campaigns to crush the remaining rival warlords and reunify the empire, amassing immense prestige and a loyal coterie of fierce generals and shrewd advisors who owed their fortunes entirely to him. This created an impossible and deeply toxic situation at court. The crown prince, rightfully fearful of his younger brother's popularity and power, formed a faction with their fourth brother, Lai Yuanji. Together, they worked to undermine Lai Shimin, poisoning their father's mind against him and allegedly attempting to have him assassinated. The court split into two hostile camps, and a bloody confrontation became inevitable. The fuse was lit in the summer of 626. The climax of this fraternal war occurred at the Quanwu Gate, the northern entrance to the Imperial Palace complex. Knowing his brothers planned to move against him, Lai Shimin decided to strike first. He laid an ambush at the gate, the very threshold of power. As Lai Jiancheng and Lai Yuanji approached for a court audience, they were met not by guards, but by Lai Shimin and his armed loyalists. In the frantic confrontation that followed, Lai Shimin personally shot and killed his elder brother Jiancheng. His general, Yuchai Jing, slew Yuanji. The violence did not stop at the gate. Lai Shimin's forces then entered the palace and effectively placed Emperor Gaiazu under house arrest. Just 3 days later, a terrified and broken Gaiazu named Lai Shimin the new crown prince. 2 months after that, he abdicated entirely. Lai Shimin ascended the dragon throne as Emperor Taizong, his reign beginning in a baptism of his brother's blood. This act of fratricide would haunt his legacy, a permanent stain that he and his court historians would work tirelessly to justify, claiming it was a necessary act of self-defense to save the nascent dynasty from the incompetence and malice of his siblings. What followed this brutal start, however, was one of the most remarkable transformations in leadership the world has ever seen. Instead of becoming a paranoid tyrant, Taizong evolved into a model of Confucian virtue and pragmatic statecraft. He seemed determined to prove that the ends of a peaceful and prosperous realm justified the horrific means. He built his government around a concept of collaborative rule, surrounding himself with extraordinarily capable ministers, many of whom had once served his defeated enemies or even his late brothers. His most famous advisor was the forthright Wei Zhang, who had actually been on the staff of the crown prince. Taizong not only pardoned him, but elevated him to the position of his chief critic. Their relationship became the stuff of legend. Wei Zhang was fearless in his remonstrations, constantly criticizing the emperor's policies and even his personal conduct, arguing that a ruler's virtue was the true foundation of his power. Taizong, though he sometimes flew into rages in private, almost always accepted the criticism publicly, stating that a ruler who surrounded himself with yes-men was doomed to fail. He famously compared Wei Zhang to a mirror, saying, "Using copper as a mirror allows one to keep his clothes neat. Using history as a mirror allows one to understand the rise and fall of states. Using a man as a mirror allows one to see what is right and wrong. Now I have lost my mirror with the death of Wei Zhang. This culture of open debate and meritocracy extended throughout his administration. Taizong refined the Sui's examination system, making it a more robust pathway for recruiting talented men from lesser aristocratic families into the bureaucracy. His reign saw the codification of a remarkably fair and detailed legal system that aimed to reduce corporal punishment and emphasize proportionality. Economically, he continued the equal field system to ensure land distribution and keep taxes light, understanding that a prosperous peasantry was the foundation of a stable state. The result was the Zhengyuan era, a period remembered as a golden age of good government, low taxes, and social harmony. The empire was not only unified internally, but began to expand outwardly, with Tang armies bringing the western regions and the Tarim Basin under their control, securing the lucrative Silk Road and making Chang'an the eastern terminus of a global trade network. This economic and military power facilitated a cultural and intellectual flourishing that was breathtaking in its cosmopolitanism. Under Taizong, the Tang capital of Chang'an became the largest and most cosmopolitan city in the world, a meticulously planned metropolis of over 1 million people from every corner of Asia. Its streets were filled with Sogdian merchants, Turkish horsemen, Korean scholars, Japanese monks, and Persian astrologers. This diversity was not just tolerated, it was embraced as a sign of the empire's universal appeal. Taizong himself practiced a policy of remarkable religious tolerance. While he and the state upheld Confucianism as the guiding philosophy of governance, he generously supported Taoist institutions, claiming descent from the sage Laozi. Most significantly, he allowed Buddhism, which had become deeply embedded in Chinese society, to flourish, sponsoring the translation of sutras and the construction of temples. Nestorian Christianity, Zoroastrianism, and later Islam were also permitted to establish communities and places of worship within the city. This open atmosphere created a cultural dynamism where art, music, poetry, and fashion from across the continent fused into a distinctly Tang style. A confident synthesis that reflected the supreme confidence of an empire at the very center of the world. The reign of Emperor Taizong thus set the template for everything that made the Tang dynasty legendary. Military might, administrative brilliance, cultural brilliance, and an open, cosmopolitan spirit that all grew from the unlikely foundation of a brother's murder at the palace gate. Yet even the golden age of Taizong, for all its cosmopolitan brilliance and meritocratic ideals, could not erase the deepest and most rigid boundary in Imperial China, the one separating men from women, and relegating the latter to the inner quarters, forever barred from the outer court of political power. It was a system so thoroughly patriarchal that the very concept of a woman ruling in her own name was not just an anomaly. It was an abomination, a cosmic perversion of the natural order as defined by Confucian doctrine. Which makes the story of Wu Zetian all the more astounding. She was not a regent pulling strings from behind a curtain, nor a dowager empress ruling through a child puppet. She was the Huangdi, the emperor herself, the sole woman in over 2 millennia of imperial history to ever officially found her own dynasty and sit upon the dragon throne. Her ascent from a low-ranking concubine to the absolute sovereign of China is a jaw-dropping narrative of supreme intelligence, meticulous planning, ruthless elimination of rivals, and an unparalleled mastery of political theater. Her journey began not in the spotlight, but in the shadows of the palace. As a young girl of 14, she was selected to enter the harem of Emperor Taizong himself, given the title of Cairn, a 5th-rank concubine. The legends surrounding her entry are already tinged with prophecy and foreboding. One famous tale recounts how Taizong had a magnificent but untamable stallion named Lioness. When no one in the court could break it, the young Wu Zetian supposedly stepped forward and declared she could, requiring only 3 things: an iron whip, an iron hammer, and a dagger. First, she said, "I will beat it with the iron whip. If it does not submit, I will use the hammer to strike its head. If that still does not work, I will use the dagger to cut its throat." Whether this story is true or apocryphal, it perfectly foreshadows the methodology she would employ her entire life: a clear-eyed, escalatory application of force, with a willingness to destroy what she could not control. Her fate truly pivoted upon Taizong's death. Custom dictated that childless concubines were to have their heads shaved and be consigned to a life of prayer in a Buddhist nunnery, a living death for an ambitious young woman. Yet Wu Zetian had made a crucial connection during her time in the palace. She had caught the eye of Taizong's son and successor, the future Emperor Gaozong. The specifics of their early relationship are murky, but she managed to escape the nunnery and re-enter the palace, now as a concubine of the new emperor. Her rise through the ranks of Gaozong's harem was a masterclass in political assassination. The primary obstacle was Empress Wang, the emperor's formal wife, and his favorite concubine, Zhao Shufei. The traditional and most infamous account claims that Wu Zetian killed her own infant daughter and framed Empress Wang for the murder. While many modern historians question the veracity of this specific event, seeing it as later propaganda, it underscores the ruthless reputation she cultivated. Whatever her methods, they were devastatingly effective. Empress Wang and Zhao Shufei were both imprisoned and later executed on Wu's orders, and in 655, she was elevated to the position of empress herself. For the next several years, she ruled not as sovereign, but as the power behind the throne. Emperor Gaozong suffered from debilitating health problems, often described as crippling headaches and dizziness that affected his eyesight. Wu Zetian began to sit in on court audiences, separated from the all-male officials by a screen, advising her husband and increasingly making decisions herself. When Gaozong died in 683, she became Empress Dowager, first ruling through her sons, but it quickly became apparent that she found them weak and incompetent. She deposed them one after another, placing them under house arrest. The final step in her audacious plan came in 690. After a series of elaborate stage-managed omens, including the appearance of a mysterious white stone, with the characters predicting a new sage mother, she accepted the pleas of her supporters and ascended the throne herself. She proclaimed a new dynasty, the Zhou, interrupting the Tang line, and took the title of sage and divine emperor. To legitimize her unprecedented rule, she needed a new ideological foundation, and she found it in Buddhism. Confucianism, with its strict hierarchical relationships where women were subordinate to men, offered her no support. Instead, she turned to a Buddhist text, the Great Cloud Sutra, which prophesied the coming of a Chakravartin, a universal monarch who would be a reincarnation of the Bodhisattva Maitreya. Wu Zetian's propagandists heavily promoted a commentary on this sutra that explicitly identified her as this Maitreya figure, a divine ruler whose femininity was not a hindrance but a sign of her sacred destiny. She poured state resources into building Buddhist temples and commissioning colossal statues, most famously the giant Vairocana Buddha at the Longmen Grottos, which bears a face said to be modeled on her own. This was a brilliant piece of political theology, using a universalist religion to circumvent the limitations of a native philosophy. As a ruler, she was formidable, capable, and utterly ruthless. She expanded the empire's borders further into Central Asia. She perfected the imperial examination system, aggressively promoting scholars of merit from lesser aristocratic families to create a new class of officials loyal directly to her, breaking the power of the old northwestern aristocratic clans who opposed her. She even created new, complex characters for her name and reign title to be used exclusively during her rule. Yet, her reign was also characterized by a pervasive police state. She relied heavily on a network of cruel officials who acted as her secret police, encouraging citizens to inform on each other. Those accused of treason were subjected to horrific torture and public executions, creating an atmosphere of terror that cowed any potential opposition. Her final years were a stark reversal of fortune. In her 70s, her health declined and she became isolated, surrounded by young lovers that alienated her court. In 705, a coup led by senior ministers and supported by the military forced her to abdicate in favor of her exiled son, Zhongzong. The Tang dynasty was restored, and her own Zhou dynasty was erased from the official record. She died later that year under house arrest. Her legacy is one of the most contested in Chinese history. For Confucian historians, she was the ultimate villain, a usurper, a murderess, and a sexually immoral woman who violated the natural order. In the modern era, however, she has been reevaluated, often hailed as a feminist icon who shattered the patriarchy centuries before such a concept even existed. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in the middle. She was a complex figure of towering ambition and political genius, who used every tool at her disposal: intellect, religion, sexuality, and sheer terror to achieve a level of power no woman before or since has ever attained in the Middle Kingdom. She proved that even the most rigid glass ceiling could be broken, though the fragments left behind were sharp enough to draw blood for centuries. At the very peak of its power and cultural brilliance, the Tang dynasty was ruled by an emperor who seemed to have it all. Emperor Xuanzong, in the first half of his long reign, was the architect of the Tang's golden age, a period of such prosperity and artistic flourishing that it became the benchmark for all of Chinese history. His court was the most dazzling on earth, a magnet for poets, painters, and musicians. But in his later years, this formidable ruler, who had commanded armies and governed an empire, would be utterly undone by a force no edict could control, and no army could defeat, an all-consuming love for one woman. This is the story of Yang Yuhuan, better known to history as Yang Gaifai, the precious consort. Their romance would become the most famous love story in Chinese history, not for its happy ending, but for its catastrophic and heartbreaking conclusion, a personal tragedy that mirrored the violent unraveling of the empire itself. Their meeting was not one of youthful passion, but of autocratic privilege. Yang Yuhuan was originally the wife of Xuanzong's 18th son, Lai Mao. During a palace gathering, the aging emperor, then in his 60s, saw her and was immediately, overwhelmingly captivated. To resolve this impossible attraction, a delicate and deeply cynical arrangement was made. The princess was asked to formally become a Taoist nun, a common ruse of the time to allow a period of separation before she could properly enter the emperor's harem. Shedding her secular life, she took the name Taizhen, and after a brief period in a convent, she was brought to the palace and bestowed the highest rank for an imperial consort, Gaifai. From that moment, she was known to the world as Yang Gaifai. She was renowned for her full, graceful beauty, a plumpness that was the Tang ideal, but her true power lay in her captivating personality. She was a gifted musician and dancer, a perfect companion for the artistically minded emperor. They were said to compose music together, with Xuanzong playing the drum and Yang Gaifai dancing, creating a private world of art and intimacy that shut out the burdens of state. This intense, exclusive devotion had grave political consequences. To please her, the emperor elevated her entire family to positions of immense power and prestige, a classic case of nepotism that the Chinese called weiqi, the influence of the external relatives. Her cousin, Yang Guozhang, was appointed chief minister despite being an arrogant and deeply incompetent official. Her three sisters were granted noble titles and became known as the Three Ladies, whose extravagant lifestyles and corruption became a public scandal. The Yang family's behavior grew so brazen that they would block public roads with their lavish processions, and it was said that simply being born a Yang became a guarantee of wealth and office. This flagrant favoritism alienated the old aristocratic families and the scholarly bureaucracy, creating a festering resentment at the very heart of the court. The emperor, blinded by his love, saw none of it, or chose not to. He had retreated entirely into his private world with Yang Gaifai, leaving the tedious affairs of government to her increasingly powerful and venal relatives. This toxic atmosphere of corruption and exclusion created the conditions for a seismic explosion. The most powerful military commander on the northern frontier was a general of mixed Sogdian and Turkic ancestry named Lushan. A man of immense girth and cunning charm, he had managed to ingratiate himself with the imperial couple. He was even permitted to enter the inner court and reportedly addressed Yang Gaifai as his foster mother, a relationship that blurred the lines of protocol in a shocking manner. But Lushan's ambition was as vast as his physique. He watched with growing contempt as the mediocre Yang Guozhang accumulated power, and a fierce rivalry developed between the frontier general and the court minister. Yang Guozhang repeatedly warned the emperor that Lushan was plotting rebellion, accusations that only served to push the paranoid general into making them a reality. In the year 755, with an army of over 150,000 battle-hardened troops loyal only to him, Enlil declared his rebellion. His forces swept south with terrifying speed, catching the complacent court completely unprepared. The glittering capital of Chang'an was now indefensible. Emperor Xuanzong was forced to do the unthinkable, abandon his magnificent palace and flee the city with a small retinue, heading for the relative safety of the Sichuan province in the southwest. The journey was one of humiliation and terror for the once mighty son of heaven. The defining moment of the tragedy occurred at Maowei Courier Station, a mere few days into their flight. The exhausted and furious Imperial Guard, who blamed the entire catastrophe on the Yang family's corruption, mutinied. They surrounded the emperor's quarters and demanded a sacrifice. They would no longer protect the throne until young Guizhang was executed and the precious consort herself was put to death. They saw her as the root of all the empire's woes. The emperor, faced with the impossible choice between his love and his own survival, capitulated. Young Guizhang was cut down by the soldiers, but the mob was not satisfied. They remained, their spears glinting, waiting. The heartbroken emperor, powerless for the first time in his life, gave the order. High-ranking eunuchs took young Gaifai to a Buddhist shrine near the station and strangled her with a silk cord. Her body was shown to the restless guards, who, upon seeing it, finally agreed to continue escorting their broken sovereign. The place of her death is still marked today, a quiet, somber sight that stands in stark contrast to the epic scale of the love and loss it represents. The rebellion was eventually suppressed, but at a horrific cost. Millions perished, the economy was shattered, and the central authority of the Tang throne was broken forever, ushering in an era of warlordism from which the dynasty would never fully recover. A broken and guilt-ridden Xuanzong abdicated in favor of his son and lived out his remaining years in an isolated palace, a ghost of his former self, haunted by the memory of his lost love. It is from this profound personal tragedy that some of China's greatest art was born. The poet Bai Juyi immortalized their story in his masterpiece, The Song of Everlasting Sorrow. He gives voice to the emperor's endless grief, writing of his shuttered halls, his lonely nights, and a desperate Taoist priest sent to search the afterlife for her spirit, who returns only with a pledge of eternal love from beyond the grave. This poem cemented their story not as a political cautionary tale, but as a timeless tragedy of love and loss, ensuring that young Gaifai would be remembered not just as a cause of a rebellion, but as an eternal symbol of beauty sacrificed on the altar of power, a woman whose story broke an emperor's heart and very nearly broke an empire. The seemingly unshakable prosperity of the Tang Golden Age was shattered by a cataclysm born from its own ambitions. The Enlil Rebellion was not a mere border conflict or a simple power struggle. It was a devastating civil war that lasted for 8 grueling years and fundamentally broke the back of the dynasty, sending shockwaves through Chinese society that would be felt for centuries. The architect of this chaos was himself a product of the Tang's cosmopolitan confidence. Enlil was a general of mixed Sogdian and Turkic ancestry who had risen through the ranks of the army stationed on the northern frontier. His success was a testament to the Tang's meritocratic system, but it also revealed its fatal flaw: the practice of allowing military governors, known as jidushi, to amass immense personal power over vast territories, commanding their own armies and collecting their own taxes. Enlil was the most powerful of them all, controlling 3 massive military districts and an army fiercely loyal to him personally, not to the distant emperor in Chang'an. The immediate spark was his bitter rivalry with Chief Minister Yang Guizhang, the cousin of the emperor's beloved consort, Yang Gaifai. Yang Guizhang, representing a corrupt and nepotistic court, repeatedly accused Enlil of treason, pushing the already paranoid general into open revolt. In 755, Enlil declared his rebellion, marching south from his base with a force of over 150,000 seasoned veterans. The Tang central government, its military strength concentrated on the frontiers and its capital guards softened by decades of peace, was caught completely unprepared. The rebel army swept through the heartland of the empire with terrifying speed, capturing the eastern capital Luoyang within months. By the summer of 756, his forces were at the gates of the magnificent capital itself, Shang. The fall of the greatest city in the world was a moment of supreme humiliation. Emperor Xuanzang, the once brilliant architect of the Golden Age, was forced to flee in a desperate, chaotic scramble under the cover of night. The imperial procession was a pitiful sight, the son of heaven, his family, and a handful of courtiers abandoning their splendor for the uncertainty of the road. The defining tragedy of this flight occurred at Maowei Courier Station. The exhausted and furious imperial guard, who blamed the Yang family for the catastrophe, mutinied. They demanded and received the heads of Yang Guozhang and, heartbreakingly, the emperor's beloved Yang Gaifai, who was strangled to death to appease the troops. This sacrifice, made to ensure his own survival, broke the aged emperor's spirit. He continued his journey to the southwestern province of Sichuan, a shattered man, while the crown prince broke away to organize a resistance in the north. What followed was a protracted and incredibly brutal war of attrition. The conflict was not a clean division between loyalists and rebels. It fragmented into a complex and bloody mess with shifting alliances, foreign involvement, and unimaginable suffering for the civilian population. The Tang loyalists, to retake their capital, made a fateful decision. They enlisted the help of the Uyghur Khaganate and even Arab mercenaries, promising them the right to loot recaptured cities as payment. The price of this victory was the systematic sacking of Chang'an and Luoyang by the empire's own allies. The human cost was staggering. Census records from before and after the rebellion suggest the population plummeted by a staggering 26 to 36 million people. While not all were direct casualties of warfare, the toll from mass displacement, famine, and the diseases that followed in its wake was apocalyptic in scale. Though the rebellion was officially quelled in 763, the Tang dynasty that emerged was a hollow shell of its former self. The central government's authority was irrevocably broken. The military governors who had helped suppress the revolt were now more powerful than ever, ruling their territories as virtually independent warlords, often passing their titles down hereditarily with little regard for the court. The once efficient equal field system collapsed, leading to the rise of great manorial estates and a loss of tax revenue. The empire's borders shrank as it lost control over Central Asia, and the glorious confidence of the early Tang was replaced by inward-looking conservatism and a deep-seated suspicion of military men and foreigners. The Lushan Rebellion established a tragic and recurring pattern in Chinese history. A strong dynasty overextends itself, leading to a loss of central control, a massive rebellion that devastates the population, and a long, slow decline where the center can never fully reassert its power. It was the definitive end of China's most cosmopolitan age, a trauma from which the imperial system would never fully recover. Out of the ashes of the Tang's collapse and the chaotic interlude of the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms period, a new kind of empire slowly coalesced, one that would redefine the very soul of Chinese civilization. The Song dynasty, founded by the shrewd general Zhao Quanjian in 960, did not pursue the Tang's model of expansive, military-driven hegemony. Instead, it cultivated an inward focus, fostering an era of unprecedented economic prosperity, technological revolution, and a cultural and philosophical flowering so profound that it would set the template for Chinese society for the next millennium. This was a renaissance built not on the strength of its cavalry, but on the power of its industry, the brilliance of its scholars, and the sophistication of its arts, creating what many historians consider to be the most advanced society on Earth at its time. The engine of this transformation was a series of breathtaking technological breakthroughs that fundamentally altered how people lived, learned, and waged war. The most transformative of these was the invention of movable type printing by the commoner Bai Sheng around the year 1040. Unlike the cumbersome woodblock printing used before, Bai Sheng's system used individual ceramic characters that could be arranged in an iron frame, used for printing, and then disassembled and reused. This was a revolution in information technology on par with the internet. The cost of producing books plummeted, making literature, Confucian classics, and study aids for the imperial examinations accessible to a vastly wider segment of the population than ever before. Literacy rates rose, a thriving commercial publishing industry was born, and ideas could now spread with a speed and efficiency that was previously unimaginable, creating a true mass culture for the first time in history. This same spirit of innovation extended to the arts of defense and destruction, most notably with the systematic development of gunpowder. While discovered accidentally by Taoist alchemists during the Tang, it was under the Song that this volatile mixture of saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal was weaponized on a grand scale. The Song military manuals detail a terrifying array of proto-gunpowder weapons, fire lances that were early flamethrowers, primitive grenades hurled by catapults, and even the earliest forms of landmines and rockets. This wasn't just for shock and awe. These weapons were deployed effectively in the Song's desperate, and ultimately losing, struggle for survival against northern nomadic empires like the Liao and the Jin. In a profound historical irony, the most culturally refined dynasty in Chinese history became the world's first to harness the destructive power of chemistry for warfare, a discovery that would eventually ripple across the globe and change the nature of conflict forever. This atmosphere of inquiry and refinement found its highest philosophical expression in the development of Neo-Confucianism. Thinkers like the brothers Cheng Hao and Cheng Yi, and later the great synthesizer Zhu Zai, looked at the chaos that had followed the Tang's collapse and asked a fundamental question: how could a truly moral and stable social order be built? They found their answer not in Buddhist spirituality, which they criticized for its world-denying aspects, but in a renewed and reimagined Confucianism. They developed a sophisticated metaphysical framework, arguing that a universal principle, or lie, existed in all things, and that the goal of human cultivation was to investigate things to extend knowledge, and to embody this principle through earnest practice. Zhu Zai codified the 4 books, the Analects, Mencius, the Great Learning, and the Doctrine of the Mean, as the core curriculum for the Imperial examinations, a move that would make his version of Neo-Confucianism the unchallenged state orthodoxy for centuries. This was no dry academic exercise. It was a comprehensive guide to living, governing, and understanding the cosmos, emphasizing self-discipline, familial duty, and social harmony. The sheer aesthetic brilliance of the age is perhaps most vividly captured in its painting and poetry. Song artists, particularly of the Southern Song period after they were forced to retreat south of the Yangtze River, perfected a style of landscape painting that remains unsurpassed. These were not literal portraits of mountains and rivers, but profound spiritual and philosophical statements. Vast, mist-shrouded panoramas would feature a single, tiny scholar gazing into the void, emphasizing humanity's small but mindful place within the immense, orderly cosmos. This monochrome ink wash style, with its exquisite attention to tonal variation and expressive brushwork, sought to capture the very essence or idea of a landscape, its eternal spirit rather than its temporary form. This same contemplative, refined sensibility infused its poetry. The Sai form, which had emerged in the Tang, reached its zenith during the Song. Unlike the strict, regulated Shi poetry, Sai were lyrics written to existing musical tunes, allowing for irregular line lengths and a more intimate, emotional, and often melancholic tone. Poets like Li Qingzhao, perhaps China's greatest female poet, used the form to document the joys of married life, the anguish of widowhood, and the profound sense of loss she felt after the Jin invasion forced her to become a refugee in her own country. Her work, and that of her contemporaries like the brilliant Su Shi, moved effortlessly from poignant observations of daily life to grand, existential musings, reflecting the Song elite's deep interiority and their intense engagement with the world of feeling. The Song dynasty's legacy is this unique fusion of the pragmatic and the sublime, a society that could engineer a compass for navigation and pen a heart-wrenching lyric, that could forge a terrifying new weapon and paint a landscape of breathtaking serenity, creating a cultural peak that continues to define the very idea of classical Chinese refinement. Yet the very sophistication and prosperity of the Song dynasty, a civilization that had reached dazzling intellectual and economic heights, rendered it a fatally tempting target for the hardened steppe powers gathering strength on its northern frontier. The dynasty's founding philosophy had been one of prioritizing civil administration over military aggression, a choice that fostered a golden age of culture, but left it perilously vulnerable. This strategic weakness was brutally exposed in one of the most shocking and humiliating catastrophes in all of Chinese history, an event so traumatic it would sear itself into the national psyche for centuries, the Jinking Incident. The road to disaster was paved not by a sudden invasion, but by a fateful and misguided diplomatic gamble. The Song had initially maintained a fragile peace with their powerful northern neighbor, the Liao dynasty, through the annual payment of tribute. However, when a new, ferocious power emerged from the northeast, the Jurchen people, who established the Jin dynasty, the Song court saw an opportunity. In a short-sighted move that abandoned centuries of strategic precedent, Song diplomats forged the alliance conducted by sea with the Jin. The plan was simple and seemingly brilliant. The Song and Jin would coordinate a pincer attack to crush their mutual enemy, the Liao. In return, the Song would regain the strategically vital 16 prefectures they had lost generations earlier. The alliance was a catastrophic miscalculation. The Jurchen warriors, hardened by life in Manchuria's harsh forests, annihilated the Liao with terrifying efficiency. In the process, they gained a priceless insight. The legendary Song army, for all its wealth and numbers, was poorly led, deeply corrupt, and utterly unprepared for a real fight. They had seen the weakness behind the cultured facade. The betrayal came almost immediately. Once the Liao were destroyed, the Jin turned on their former allies with breathtaking speed. Jurchen cavalry armies, masters of lightning-fast warfare, swept across the North China Plain. They bypassed fortified cities and struck deep into Song territory. Their advance so rapid the court in the capital, Bynliang, was caught in a state of paralyzed disbelief. The aging Emperor Huizong, a man far more devoted to his exquisite calligraphy, refined art collection, and Taoist pursuits than to the dreary business of governance, panicked. In a desperate act of abdicating responsibility, he abruptly handed the throne to his young and inexperienced son, who became Emperor Qinzong, and then fled the capital. This left a terrified young emperor and a court riddled with factional strife to face the greatest crisis of the age. What followed was a masterclass in failed statecraft and self-delusion. The Jin armies laid siege to Bynliang, but the city's massive walls and large garrison should have made it impregnable. Instead of mounting a robust defense, Emperor Qinzong's court was dominated by officials who placed their faith in desperate superstition and appeasement. They employed a self-proclaimed magician, Guo Jing, who claimed he could summon divine soldiers from the celestial army to defeat the Jurchens. While this charlatan performed his rituals on the city walls, the real Jurchen soldiers watched in bemused contempt. Simultaneously, the Song pursued a policy of buying time with gold and promises. They agreed to every exorbitant demand from the Jin commanders. Vast quantities of gold, silver, silk, and precious objects were gathered and handed over. They even sent imperial princes and high-ranking officials as hostages. This only convinced the Jurchens that the Song were both weak and incredibly wealthy, a combination that invited further extortion, not mercy. The final, unbearable humiliation occurred in the spring of 1127. After a brief lifting of the siege, the Jin forces returned, their demands now impossible. The Song had failed to meet the full ransom quota, providing a pretext for the Jurchens to escalate. They summoned the two emperors, the abdicated Huizong and the reigning Qinzong, to their camp outside the city walls for negotiations. It was a trap. Once the imperial party entered the Jin camp, they were immediately taken prisoner. The Jurchen commanders then ordered the gates of Bynliang to be opened. With their emperor a captive, the will of the city's defenders broke completely. Jin soldiers marched into one of the greatest cities on earth unopposed. The sack that followed was not merely a plundering of wealth, it was a systematic erasure of a civilization's heart. The imperial libraries, art collections, and musical instruments, the very treasures Emperor Huizong had spent his life curating, were looted. Thousands of imperial clansmen, craftsmen, artists, and officials were taken captive. The two emperors, their empresses, and nearly the entire imperial court were stripped of their robes, dressed in the humble garb of commoners, and forced into ox carts to begin a long, degrading march north into the bitter cold of Manchuria as prisoners of war. This event, known as the Jinking Incident, did not just end a siege. it annihilated the Northern Song dynasty. The loss was so total, so complete, that it represented a profound rupture in the Chinese world order. The emperor, the son of heaven, was not supposed to be captured. His person was sacred, the mediator between heaven and earth. His captivity was an unthinkable cosmic failure. One of the few princes to escape the net, Zhao Gu, fled south. Eventually, he re-established the dynasty with a new capital at Linen, modern-day Hangzhou, beginning the era known as the Southern Song. But this was a rump state, a wounded entity forever conscious of what it had lost. The psychological and political impact of Jingkang cannot be overstated. It created a deep and enduring trauma, a national humiliation that fueled a powerful revanchist sentiment, a burning desire to reclaim the lost northern territories and avenge the insult to the Imperial house. This longing became a central theme in Southern Song culture and politics. It gave rise to defiant, patriotic poets like Xin Kiji and Lu Yu, whose verses are filled with a bitter fury and a desperate hope for northern recovery. It propelled the career of the legendary General Yu Fei, who won stunning victories against the Jin and seemed on the cusp of retaking the old capital before he was betrayed and executed by appeasement-minded officials at court. The incident cemented a lasting, deep-seated suspicion of northern barbarians in the Chinese political consciousness, a wariness that would shape foreign policy for generations. Jingkang became the ultimate cautionary tale, a stark reminder that cultural refinement and economic wealth were meaningless without the military power to defend them, a lesson written in the tears of two emperors led away in chains. While his grandfather Genghis had shattered the northern Jin dynasty, it fell to Kublai Khan to complete the Mongol conquest of all China, a grueling campaign that would ultimately take over 7 decades from start to finish. The greatest prize and the most formidable obstacle was the Southern Song, a realm of immense wealth and stubborn resilience. Kublai understood that overwhelming force alone would not suffice against a civilization defended by mountains, rivers, and a deeply entrenched sense of cultural superiority. His strategy was one of meticulous adaptation and psychological warfare. He leveraged the expertise of Chinese engineers to build a powerful navy, something the Mongols had never before needed, to challenge the Song on the waterways that were their lifeline. The final campaign was a masterwork of multi-pronged strategy, with his greatest general, Bayan, a man reportedly worth 10,000 soldiers, leading a methodical sweep down the Yangtze River. The climactic siege of Xianyang, lasting 5 years, demonstrated this new approach. It was not a wild cavalry charge, but a protracted blockade and artillery barrage, featuring massive counterweight trebuchets designed by Persian engineers that could hurl 100-kilogram stones and crush the strongest fortifications. This relentless pressure finally broke the Song's will. The last loyalists, including the young boy emperor and his minister Lu Ziufu, were pushed to the very edge of the sea. In a final tragic act of defiance, rather than surrender, Lu Ziufu embraced the child and leaped from a cliff into the waves, bringing the glorious Song dynasty to a heartbreaking end. With the conquest complete, Kublai Khan faced the monumental task of ruling a civilization whose population vastly outnumbered and intellectually dwarfed its Mongol conquerors. His solution was a delicate and often contradictory balancing act, a system of ethno-legal stratification that defined the Yuan dynasty. At the top were the Mongols themselves, the ruling caste who held all senior military and key government positions. Next came the Semu, or various kinds of people, a category comprising allies from the West Uyghurs, Tibetans, Tanguts, Persians, and Arabs, who were valued for their administrative skills and loyalty, and served as a crucial buffer class. Below them were the Hanren, meaning Northern Chinese, Koreans, and Khittans, who had been subjugated earlier. At the very bottom were the Nanren, or Southerners, the vast majority of the population from the former Song lands, who faced the most restrictions and heaviest taxes. This system was designed to prevent assimilation and maintain Mongol identity and control. Yet to actually administer the world's largest land empire, Kublai had no choice but to adopt the very Chinese bureaucratic machinery he distrusted. He established a central secretariat, adopted a Chinese reign title, and moved his capital from the steppe to a new city he built, Dadu, what we now know as Beijing. This city was a powerful symbol of his dual rule. Its layout followed Chinese geomantic principles, yet at its heart were vast spaces for the jurors of the Mongol Imperial Guard, a steppe encampment at the center of a sophisticated Chinese capital. It was this cosmopolitan court at Dadu that was witnessed and immortalized by a most unlikely visitor, a young Venetian merchant named Marco Polo. His famous travelogue, while sometimes questioned by historians, paints a breathtaking picture of Yuan China as a land of almost unimaginable splendor and organization. He described a postal relay system with thousands of stations and horses that allowed messages to cross the empire with stunning speed, a network of granaries for famine relief, and the widespread use of paper money, which he observed with astonishment, noting that the Khan's mint could produce currency that was as valuable as gold. He was awestruck by the scale of Dadu, its lavish palace walls painted in vermilion and yellow, its roofs gleaming with brilliant glazed tiles, and its storerooms overflowing with silks and treasures. He recounted vast, opulent hunting excursions and banquets served to tens of thousands of guests on priceless porcelain and precious metals. Whether entirely accurate or not, Marco Polo's account transmitted to a skeptical Europe the image of Cathay as the quintessential land of wealth and sophistication, a reputation that would tantalize explorers for centuries and fundamentally alter the course of world history. Despite his mastery over mainland China, Kublai Khan's ambitions stretched across the waves, leading to two of the most famous and disastrous naval invasions in history. His attempts to subjugate Japan were born of a belief that all nations owed submission to the Great Khan. In 1274 and again in 1281, he launched massive armadas from Korea and China, comprising thousands of vessels and tens of thousands of soldiers. The Japanese samurai, though vastly outnumbered, fought with ferocious determination on the beaches of Hakata Bay. But it was nature, not the samurai, that delivered the final blow. On both occasions, but most famously the second, a massive typhoon, a kamikaze, or divine wind, swept across the Sea of Japan, shattering the Mongol fleet, drowning countless men, and scattering the invasion force. These storms cemented a powerful national myth in Japan of divine protection that would endure for centuries. Undeterred by this failure, Kublai also set his sights on the island of Java, lured by tales of its wealth. The invasion of 1292 was a logistical nightmare from the start. The tropical climate and unfamiliar terrain ravaged the Mongol forces with disease, and their local ally, Prince Wijaya, turned on them after they helped him defeat a rival. The campaign ended in a bloody retreat, a costly and humiliating failure that stretched the empire's resources for no gain. These maritime defeats revealed the limits of Mongol power, demonstrating that their unparalleled skill on horseback did not translate to mastery of the seas or of tropical warfare. Kublai Khan's final years were a poignant contrast to his earlier triumphs. The great ruler became isolated, grief-stricken by the death of his favorite wife Chabai and his chosen heir, Zhenjin. He retreated into a life of luxury and seclusion, increasingly plagued by ill health and depression. The administrative system he built began to creak under the weight of its own contradictions. The cost of his lavish projects and failed wars had drained the treasury, leading to hyperinflation of the paper currency he was so proud of. The ethnic tensions inherent in his four-class system festered, breeding resentment among the vast Han Chinese population. By the time of his death in 1294, the Yuan dynasty was already showing the cracks that would, within a few generations, lead to its collapse. His legacy is one of profound paradox. He was the barbarian conqueror who became a Chinese emperor, the nomadic steppe lord who built one of the world's greatest cities, and the visionary who unified China, but whose foreign ambitions ultimately underscored the limits of his immense power. He presided over an unprecedented era of trans-Eurasian exchange, yet his rule planted the seeds of nativist rebellion that would eventually expel his descendants and restore a native Chinese dynasty. For decades, the Yuan dynasty's ethnic hierarchy had pressed down upon the Han Chinese majority like a heavy stone, a constant, grating reminder of their subjugated status. The Mongol rulers and their allied Semu officials enjoyed privileges and freedoms denied to the native population, while heavy taxes and forced labor drained the countryside. But it was a combination of natural disaster and spiritual fervor that finally turned simmering resentment into a roaring, all-consuming fire. In the 1330s and 40s, the North China Plain was ravaged by a series of catastrophic floods of the Yellow River, followed by devastating outbreaks of plague. The Yuan government's response was not relief, but a massive and poorly managed project to redirect the river, conscripting hundreds of thousands of desperate peasants into backbreaking labor under the whip of Mongol overseers. This was the final straw. The land was ripe for rebellion, and the spark came not from a warrior or a general, but from a powerful, intoxicating idea, the belief that the world was ending and a new age of light was dawning. This millenarian prophecy was spread by the White Lotus Society, a Buddhist sect that preached the coming of Maitreya, the future Buddha, who would descend to purify a corrupt world and usher in an era of perfect peace and justice. For a population living through what seemed like biblical calamities under a foreign yoke, this message was electrifying. It gave their suffering a divine purpose and promised imminent salvation. The rebels adopted the red turban as their symbol, a sign of their allegiance to the Ming king, a messianic figure prophesied to lead them to victory. This was not a coordinated military campaign in its early days. It was a chaotic, sprawling uprising of countless local groups, all sharing the same fervent belief and the same burning desire to expel the Mongol, demons, and restore a righteous order. They were farmers, monks, and salt smugglers, armed with little more than faith and farming tools, yet they fought with a terrifying conviction that heaven itself was on their side. Amidst this whirlwind of competing rebel leaders, one figure slowly began to distinguish himself through sheer pragmatism and strategic genius. Zhu Yuanzhang was an unlikely candidate for founder of a dynasty. Orphaned by famine and plague as a teenager, he had begged for food before finding refuge as a novice in a Buddhist monastery. When that monastery was destroyed by Yuan troops, he had nowhere left to go but into the arms of the rebellion. What he lacked in noble birth, he made up for with a keen intellect, a formidable memory, and a talent for attracting loyal and capable followers. While other rebel leaders acted like bandit kings, plundering and moving on, Zhu understood that to hold territory, he needed to win the hearts of the people. He imposed strict discipline on his troops, forbidding them from looting the villages they liberated. Most importantly, he listened to a group of Confucian scholars who advised him to focus on building a stable agricultural base to build high walls, store up grain, and delay claiming kingship. This patient, methodical approach set him apart. He was not just a rebel, he was an administrator in waiting. The final campaign to drive the Mongols from their throne was a masterstroke of psychological warfare as much as military might. By 1367, Zhu had consolidated control over southern China. His northern expedition was meticulously planned. His generals, Zhu Da and Shang Yuchun, led a battle-hardened army that avoided direct, pitched battles with the still formidable Mongol cavalry whenever possible. Instead, they focused on capturing key cities and winning over the population with promises of orderly government and an end to the hated ethnic classifications. As they advanced, they disseminated propaganda that portrayed the Yuan rulers as having lost the mandate of heaven, pointing to the natural disasters and the court's internal decadence as clear signs of divine disapproval. By the time his armies approached the capital, Dadu, the Yuan court was already fractured by infighting. The last Mongol emperor, Toghun Temür, did not put up a last stand. Seeing the hopelessness of his situation, he fled north through the gates of the city and back onto the steppe, leaving his magnificent capital to fall without a major fight. The Ming army entered Dadu, and Zhu Yuanzhang proclaimed the new Ming dynasty, choosing the reign title Hongwu, meaning vastly martial. Having achieved the impossible, the new emperor faced an even greater challenge: how to rebuild a shattered nation and ensure no such foreign domination could ever happen again. His vision for the Ming was one of absolute control, hypervigilance, and a militant reassertion of Han Chinese culture. He became one of the most powerful, industrious, and paranoid autocrats in history. He centralized power to an unprecedented degree, abolishing the position of chief minister and personally reviewing thousands of state documents each day, micromanaging every aspect of the empire from the capital in Nanjing. He instituted a nationwide system of household registration that tied families to their land and occupation, creating a static, easily controllable social order. Terrified of the court intrigue that had weakened previous dynasties, he launched purges that eliminated tens of thousands of officials and generals, even those who had been his most loyal companions in the rebellion. His rule was founded on a profound suspicion of the outside world, a conviction that China's greatness was internal and must be protected from foreign contamination at all costs. This mindset gave birth to the policy that would define the Ming for centuries, a turn inward toward isolationism. While the early Ming did sponsor the spectacular naval expeditions of Admiral Zheng He, these were ultimately an expression of imperial power projection, not a desire for sustained exchange. After the initial show of force, the voyages were halted, their ships left to rot, and their records burned. The real focus became defense. Emperor Hongwu ordered the massive reconstruction and strengthening of the Great Wall, transforming what had been a series of disconnected fortifications into the continuous, imposing stone barrier we recognize today. This was not just a military barrier, it was a psychological one, a clear line drawn between the civilized, agrarian Chinese world and the chaotic, nomadic, barbarian other. The legacy of the Red Turban Rebellion was thus a paradox, a popular, messianic mass movement that overthrew an oppressive foreign regime only to replace it with a native dynasty that was, in its own way, even more rigid, controlling, and closed off from the world, believing that true security lay not in expansion, but in building the highest walls and looking firmly within. Yet the immense power and paranoid control of the Hongwu Emperor could not settle the fundamental question of succession. Upon his death, the throne did not pass peacefully. Instead, it ignited a brutal civil war that pitted the founding emperor's chosen heir against his most ambitious and capable son, a conflict that would bring to power one of the most formidable rulers in Ming history and set the stage for some of its most legendary achievements. This is the story of the Yongle Emperor, a man who seized the dragon throne by force and then dedicated his reign to a series of breathtaking projects designed to erase the stain of his usurpation and prove, beyond any doubt, that he was heaven's true chosen sovereign. The crisis began when Hongwu's designated heir, his eldest son, the Crown Prince Yu Baiyou, died unexpectedly in 1392. Grief-stricken and perhaps swayed by sentiment, the aging emperor passed over his other adult sons and named Zhu Baiyou's young son, Zhu Yunwen, as the next in line. When Hongwu died in 1398, this teenager ascended as the Jianwen emperor. He was bookish, influenced by a court of Confucian scholars who urged him to roll back his grandfather's harsh policies and, most dangerously, to weaken the power of the regional princes, his own uncles. These uncles, sons of Hongwu granted vast semi-independent fiefdoms on the frontiers, were experienced generals with powerful private armies. The most formidable of them was Zhu Dai, the Prince of Yan, whose capital was at Beijing, where he had spent years honing his military skill against Mongol raids on the northern frontier. He was a warrior prince in his prime, and he watched with growing alarm as his nephew began stripping his relatives of their titles and troops. When imperial forces moved to surround his palace, Zhu Dai made his move. He did not declare himself emperor. He proclaimed a righteous revolt to rescue the young emperor from his evil advisors, a campaign he called the Jingnan, or pacification of the troubles. The ensuing civil war was a desperate, roller coaster struggle. Outnumbered and officially branded a rebel, Zhu Dai's survival depended on his brilliant generalship, the elite cavalry he had trained on the steppe frontier, and a series of bold, high-risk maneuvers. In a pivotal moment, with his forces overstretched, he learned that the imperial army guarding the capital Nanjing had been dispatched to the north, leaving the city virtually undefended. In a stunning strategic gamble, he ignored the enemy armies in his rear and led his core troops on a lightning-fast march straight down the Grand Canal, hundreds of miles south, to strike directly at the heart of the empire. The gamble worked perfectly. He appeared at the gates of Nanjing before the main imperial forces could respond. Treachery from within opened the city to him. As his troops flooded into the capital, the imperial palace erupted in flames. The body of the young Jianwen emperor was never conclusively identified, lost to the fire. his fate becoming one of history's great mysteries and a ghost that would haunt his uncle's reign. With no one left to oppose him, Zhu Dai claimed the throne, declaring the Yongle, perpetual happiness, era. Now the usurper emperor, Yongle faced a crippling crisis of legitimacy. He had violently overthrown his nephew, the rightful heir designated by the revered Hongwu emperor. To the Confucian scholar officials, this was the worst kind of treason. His first brutal act was to purge the court of those who had remained loyal to Jianwen, executing thousands of officials and their families in a reign of terror designed to crush all opposition. But fear alone would not make him a legitimate emperor. He needed to demonstrate, through undeniable, monumental achievement, that heaven had truly chosen him. His reign became a breathtaking display of power and patronage, a series of grand projects so vast they would forever overshadow the means by which he gained power. His most iconic and enduring act was to move the capital. Nanjing was steeped in the legacy of his father and his nephew. It was a city of ghosts and lingering loyalties. His own power base was in the north, in Beijing, the city where he had been prince, but moving the capital was about more than personal security. It was a profound strategic statement. He argued that the real threat to the empire came from the northern steppes, and that the Son of Heaven must guard the gates himself. He embarked on the construction of a Chinese letter, magnificent capital, centered around a palace complex so immense and awe-inspiring it would become known the world over, the Forbidden City. For 14 years, over 1 million laborers toiled to build it, using priceless Phoebe Zhenin wood from the southwestern jungles and massive blocks of marble quarried from near Beijing. Every detail, from the number of roof figures to the layout of the halls, was dictated by cosmological principles, designed to project the emperor's absolute power and his role as the cosmic pivot between heaven and earth. When completed, it was a city within a city, a vermilion-walled universe of 9,999.5 rooms, a number just shy of the 10,000 rooms of the heavenly Purple Palace, symbolizing the emperor's supreme but still subordinate status to the cosmos. Simultaneously, Yongle looked outward, authorizing the most spectacular naval expeditions the world had ever seen. He placed them under the command of a remarkable man, Zheng He, a Muslim eunuch from Yunnan who had risen to become a trusted military commander. The scale of these treasure fleets is still staggering to contemplate. The largest ships, the treasure ships, were reportedly over 400 feet long, dwarfing the vessels of Columbus and da Gama that would sail decades later. The fleets consisted of hundreds of ships carrying tens of thousands of sailors, soldiers, diplomats, and doctors. Their mission was not colonization or conquest in the European sense, but the projection of Ming power and prestige. They were to bring the myriad states of the Western Oceans into the Ming tributary system, demonstrating the Yongle Emperor's universal sovereignty through a breathtaking display of generosity and overwhelming force. From 1405 to 1433, Zheng He made 7 voyages, reaching Southeast Asia, India, the Persian Gulf, and the east coast of Africa. He returned with exotic animals like giraffes, hailed as auspicious Kilin, and envoys from dozens of kingdoms willing to acknowledge the Ming Emperor's supremacy. These voyages were the ultimate expression of Yongle's ambition, to make his court the undisputed center of the known world, and finally, to cement his legacy as a cultured ruler and not just a warlord, he commissioned the largest encyclopedia in pre-modern history. The Yongle Dadian was a colossal endeavor to compile all significant knowledge written in Chinese. A team of over 2,000 scholars spent 5 years combing through 7,000 ancient texts on subjects ranging from astronomy and geography to medicine, drama, and divination. The final work contained 11,995 volumes and over 350 million characters. It was too vast to ever be printed. Only 3 manuscript copies were ever made. This was not a project meant for public consumption. It was a monumental act of cultural possession, a symbolic gathering of all written wisdom under the auspices of the Yongle Emperor's court, proving that his reign was not only one of martial power and architectural splendor, but also the pinnacle of scholarly achievement and the rightful custodian of Chinese civilization itself. Through the Forbidden City, the treasure fleets, and the encyclopedia, Yongle constructed a legacy of such monumental scale that it was designed to be incontestable, a permanent rebuttal to anyone who would whisper that his right to rule was anything less than divine. For nearly 3 decades, the mighty Ming dynasty was governed by a ghost. While the empire's vast bureaucracy continued to function, its supreme leader, the Wanli Emperor, was conspicuously absent. He refused to hold court audiences, leaving his throne empty. He ignored the piles of memorials from his ministers piling up in his study, documents requiring the Imperial vermilion ink brush to authorize everything from military promotions to tax relief. He became a recluse within the very heart of power, the Forbidden City, a silent and stubborn sovereign whose extraordinary withdrawal from public life would become one of history's most puzzling acts of royal protest. This wasn't a brief period of mourning or illness. It was a systemic, decades-long strike that brought the machinery of imperial government to a grinding halt, all stemming from a deeply personal conflict that escalated into a constitutional crisis. To understand Wanli's drastic action, we must first meet the man who shaped his entire world and instilled in him a profound sense of duty and repression, Grand Secretary Zhang Zhezheng. Appointed by Wanli's father, Zhang acted as the young emperor's regent and sole tutor, a figure of immense intellectual authority and stern discipline. Zhang Zhezheng was a brilliant administrator, a reformer who streamlined the government and strengthened the empire's finances with his famous single whip reform. But to the boy emperor, he was a terrifying taskmaster. Wanli's education was relentless, a grueling schedule of Confucian classics and historical texts that began before dawn. If the young sovereign made a mistake in his recitations, Zhang Zhezheng would not hesitate to sharply correct him, even scolding him in front of the entire court. He controlled every aspect of Wanli's life, even his personal spending, enforcing a strict austerity on the imperial household. For years, the emperor lived in awe and fear of this formidable man, conditioned to believe that his every action must be for the state, with no room for personal desire. This intense pressure created a powerful desire for an outlet, which Wanli found in the extravagant world beyond the palace lectures. He developed a passionate love for spending, commissioning lavish jewelry and fine silks. Most tellingly, he became obsessed with his own mausoleum, a vast underground palace that would take 6 years and consume a staggering 8 million ounces of silver to build. A staggering sum at a time when the state treasury was being carefully husbanded by Zhang Zhezheng. This project was more than just preparation for the afterlife. It was a declaration of self, a tangible expression of an identity that was being stifled daily by his minister's control. The emperor was building a monument to the person he was not allowed to be. The entire dynamic shattered upon Zhang Zhezheng's death. The impeccable, moralistic facade of the Grand Secretary crumbled almost immediately. A wave of accusations and investigations, likely encouraged by Wanli himself, revealed a stunning hypocrisy. Zhang Zhezheng, the man who had enforced draconian frugality on his emperor, had lived in unimaginable luxury. His household was found to possess riches that rivaled the imperial family's, and his personal life was revealed to be filled with the very indulgences he had forbidden Wanli. For the young emperor, this was not just a political scandal, it was a profound personal betrayal. The man who had been his moral compass, his surrogate father, and his intellectual god was exposed as a fraud. The entire Confucian edifice of virtue and selfless service that had been drilled into him suddenly seemed like a lie, a tool used by powerful ministers to control him while they did as they pleased. This bitter disillusionment set the stage for the central conflict of his reign, the succession crisis. Wanli had a deep, genuine affection for one of his consorts, Lady Zheng, and he adored the son she bore him, Yu Changsun. His official wife, the Empress, had only given him a daughter, and by the strict rules of Confucian primogeniture, the title of Crown Prince should have passed to his firstborn son by any consort, a boy named Zhu Changliuo. But Wanli could not bear the thought. He wanted to make Zhu Changsun, the son of the woman he loved, his heir. This desire put him on a direct collision course with the entire civil bureaucracy. To the ministers, this was not a matter of personal feeling. It was a fundamental attack on the principle of ancestral law that held the entire state together. Without a clear, indisputable line of succession, the empire could fracture into civil war upon his death. They mounted a relentless campaign of memorials, protests, and passive resistance, refusing to process any of the emperor's other edicts until he formally named the eldest son as crown prince. This is where Wanli's protests truly began. Faced with a wall of bureaucratic opposition he could not breach, he chose a weapon of the weak: withdrawal. He simply stopped playing the game. If he could not rule as he wished in the matter most personal to him, then he would not rule at all. His refusal to meet his ministers, to make appointments, or to approve documents was not laziness or decadence. It was a calculated, passive-aggressive strike. He was holding the entire government hostage over a point of principle. The system was designed to require the emperor's active participation, and by withholding it, he brought the state to a standstill. Key official positions remained empty for years, leaving ministries leaderless. Military campaigns went underfunded and unauthorized. The northern frontiers, where the Manchus were beginning to gather strength, were neglected. The empire began to rot from the head down, all because a disillusioned emperor, betrayed by his mentor and thwarted by his officials, decided that if he could not have his way in his own house, then no one would. His decades of silence were the loudest protest imaginable, a desperate and ultimately devastating attempt to assert a personal will against the immense, impersonal machine of the Ming state. The final, crushing weight of 276 years of Ming rule settled on the shoulders of one desperate man, the Chongzhen Emperor. He had inherited a collapsing empire from his reclusive grandfather, Wanli, a kingdom hollowed out by corruption, emptied by famine, and surrounded by enemies. For 17 years, he had fought a hopeless, two-front war, striving to be the diligent ruler his predecessors were not. He rose at dawn, worked deep into the night, dressed in patched robes, and tried to root out the corruption festering in his court. But his efforts were like trying to bail out a flooded ship with a teacup. The treasury was bankrupt, emptied by the endless campaigns against the Manchu invaders in the north and the swelling tide of peasant rebellions sweeping across the interior. His own government, a nest of factional intrigue, often seemed to work against him, with ministers more interested in their own power struggles than in saving the dynasty. He was a man trying to single-handedly hold back a tidal wave, and in the spring of 1644, the wave finally broke. The immediate threat came not from the Manchu banners beyond the Great Wall, but from within. A former minor Ming official turned rebel king, Li Zicheng, had united the countless bands of starving peasants and disgruntled soldiers into a formidable army he called the Dashan, or Great Shun. As his forces marched relentlessly toward the capital, Beijing, city after city simply opened its gates. Their defenders and citizens too weary, too hungry, or too disillusioned to fight for a dynasty that could no longer feed or protect them. The news that reached the Forbidden City was a cascade of catastrophes. The Chongzhen Emperor's last, desperate attempts to rally a defense collapsed. He pleaded with his ministers for funds, but the wealthy families of the capital refused to contribute, hoarding their silver even as the empire crumbled around them. He ordered a trusted eunuch to lead the defense of a crucial pass, only for the man to surrender without a fight. Every pillar of the state was proving to be rotten. On the morning of April 24th, the reality became inescapable. The thunder of Li Zicheng's cannons echoed through the streets of Beijing. The outer city had fallen. The rebellion was now inside the walls. Panic erupted in the palace. The Chongzhen Emperor, knowing the end had come, performed one final, symbolic act as the Son of Heaven. He summoned his family to a last, heartbreaking audience. To his Empress, Zhu, he said, "You are the mother of the country. You must die." Understanding her duty to avoid the dishonor of capture, she returned to her quarters and hanged herself. The emperor then turned to his 15-year-old daughter, Princess Changping. Legend says he wept as he covered his own face with his sleeve and struck at her with his sword, crying, "Why were you born into my family?" He wounded her, and she collapsed, later to be saved by palace attendants. He then ensured his 3 sons were smuggled out of the palace in the hope of preserving the imperial line. With his domestic duties complete, he made his way to the outer court, the realm of his government. He rang the great bell, summoning his ministers to an emergency audience. No one came. The throne hall was utterly empty. The men who had counseled, criticized, and failed him had all fled for their lives. The silence in that vast hall was the loudest verdict of all. The mandate of heaven had been irrevocably withdrawn. Abandoned by his state, he left the Forbidden City for the last time with only a single loyal eunuch at his side. They walked to the nearby hill behind the palace, known today as Prospect Hill or Coal Hill. There, beneath the branches of an old locust tree, the last emperor of the Ming Dynasty took his own life. He hanged himself, ensuring he would never be taken alive and humiliated by the rebel leader. In the note he left written in his own blood on the hem of his robe, he blamed his ministers for the disaster and pleaded with Liza Cheng to spare his people. It was a final, tragic act of a ruler who believed he had failed in his most sacred duty. His death did not bring peace. Liza Cheng's rebel forces poured into the city, and his brief reign as emperor of the Shun dynasty began. But his victory was short-lived. The Manchu armies, watching the chaos from the north, saw their moment. A Ming general guarding the strategic Shanhai Pass, Wu Sangui, famously made the fateful decision to open the gates and invite the Manchus in to help him defeat the usurper. The Manchu forces, led by the regent Dorgan, swept into Beijing, crushed Liza Cheng's army, and claimed the capital for themselves. They presented themselves not as foreign conquerors, but as avengers who had come to punish the rebels and honor the fallen Ming emperor. They gave the Chongzhen emperor a proper burial, a masterful act of political theater that helped legitimize their takeover. The Qing dynasty had begun. The suicide on Prospect Hill was more than a personal tragedy. It was the dramatic, violent pivot point between two eras, closing the book on native Han Chinese rule for centuries and opening a new chapter where China would be led by the Manchu people, forever altering the course of its history. And so our journey through the 30 epic tales of the Celestial Kingdoms draws to a close, not with a final answer, but with a deeper appreciation for the grand and recurring patterns that have shaped one of the world's most enduring civilizations. These stories, spanning millennia, reveal a powerful rhythm of rise and fall, a constant pulse of innovation pushing against the weight of tradition, and an eternal, often heartbreaking, tension between the raw exercise of power and the moral compass that seeks to guide it. We see it in the mythical virtue of the Yellow Emperor, the pragmatic ruthlessness of Qin Shi Huang, the philosophical idealism of Wang Mang, and the administrative genius of the Song. Each dynasty, in its own way, grappled with the same fundamental questions. What gives a ruler the right to govern? What is the price of unity? And how does a civilization preserve its soul amidst the relentless demands of power? These narratives are far more than ancient history. They are profound lessons in leadership and human nature. They teach us that authority granted by heaven can be withdrawn by the people, that the greatest strength often lies in delegation and trust, as shown by Liu Bang, and that unchecked ambition, no matter how well-intentioned, can lead to self-destruction, a lesson written in the tragic stories of Emperor Yang of Sui and the Chongzhen Emperor. We see that the most lasting legacies are often not monuments of stone, but systems of thought, the bureaucratic framework of the Qin, the examination system refined by the Tang and Song, and the philosophical foundations of Confucianism and Taoism that continue to influence billions of lives today. These tales hold up a mirror to our own world, reflecting timeless struggles between central control and regional autonomy, between cultural openness and isolationism, and between the relentless drive for progress and the deep human need for stability and meaning. Ultimately, the Celestial Kingdoms show us that civilization is not a static achievement, but a continuous, dynamic process. It is a fragile garden that requires constant tending, a complex weave of stories, laws, art, and beliefs that can be torn apart by rebellion or neglect, yet possesses an incredible resilience to regenerate, often emerging from periods of chaos with renewed creativity and strength, as seen in the cultural flourishing that followed the upheaval of the northern and southern dynasties. These 30 tales are a testament to the incredible human capacity for both creation and destruction, for profound wisdom and staggering folly. They remind us that history is not merely a list of dates and emperors, but a rich tapestry of individual choices, grand visions, and unintended consequences. Now we turn to you. With 30 epic tales laid out, which celestial kingdom captivated your imagination the most? Was it the tragic romance of Emperor Xuanzong and Yang Guifei, the brilliant cunning of Zhu Ziliang, the shocking audacity of Wu Zetian, or the determined integrity of the 7 sages of the Bamboo Grove? Share your favorite story and the lessons you took from it in the comments below. We read every single one. If you want to continue this journey with us, make sure to like this video and subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss our next exploration into the mysteries of the past.